You're watching Medfield TV, community shows.
Well, welcome. Glad to see everybody here. For anyone who doesn't know, my name is Gus Murby. I'm on the Board of Selectmen, but the reason I'm here tonight is that I'm also the chair of the ALS Study Committee. So I've been working for the last, 10 months since last June with originally a group of 10 people to try, coming out of the last annual town meeting, one of the actions, while the funding that was put up on one of the articles to give us a backup for hiring private ambulance service in the event that we lost mutual aid for ALS support over the course of the year, while that funding article didn't pass, the one thing that did come out of the annual town meeting was the action to form an ALS study committee and to figure out the best way to bring ALS to Medfield. So there were 10 people on the committee. I'll go through the structure shortly, but what I'm going to do is see if I can do an attendance list. So I'm going to start over and just quickly introduce the members of the committee who are here. So Chief Meany is one of the members of the committee. Holly Rand, physician's assistant who teaches ACLS, is a member of the committee. Steve Caskey, another member of the committee. Chad Boylan, who's a lieutenant in the Framingham Fire Department. I can't call out you yet. Let's see, who else am I missing? Where's, Neil O'Connor. Is that it? Do you have anybody else on the committee? Jeff Bonatti and Christine Treoweiler. And we had Tom.
Brendan.
And Brent, there's Brent, thank you. Okay, you guys are all supposed to be here. There's all these, it's like the front row of, in the front pew in a church here. And Brendan McNiff, Brendan, I might mention, is former Medfield resident, former member of the fire department here, but lives in Rentham, is the chief operating officer of Falk Ambulance Service. And in particular, I'm calling him out because first off, what you should know is we had somebody from Rentham, even though he has ties to Medfield, but he actually signed up to volunteer on this committee. And he's been a tremendous source of expertise around the business modeling side. So the economics of this, I can guarantee you the quality of what we're doing and what we're talking about here wouldn't be a tenth of what it is if we didn't have Brendan's support. And he comes in from Rentham to do this. So we're deeply appreciative that he's been willing to do that, and he's been a big contributor. There are two people, you'll see this on the chart, there are two people, and I don't see one of them here, but Chief Hollingshead, since coming on board as an interim chief, has been invaluable. Do you want to introduce Chief Carrico?
Feel free.
Okay, well, on behalf of our new fire chief, Chief Carrico in the back of the room, who's also here attending, if this room stays as warm as it is, you can take your tie off. I can tell you that much. We also had Tom Marie, who's the chair of the warrant committee this year, who was a member of the committee because there was a warrant committee representative that we wanted on it. Tom was not only a member of this committee, he was obviously the chair of the warrant committee in what has turned out to be a very difficult budget year, and he was also a member of the fire contract bargaining unit. So it's one thing to have a two-way conflict of interest between two roles that you have, but when you have three roles and you're trying to reconcile or figure out your way through conflicts of interest, I think that's probably nearly impossible, and so he stepped down from this committee just to simplify his life a bit. But throughout this whole effort, he's been invaluable help. What we want to do tonight is to help ensure that you all walk away with an understanding of what Article 16 is. We're going to do two things. We're actually going to give you a little bit of background on ALS. For those who aren't really sure what's the difference between a paramedic and an EMT, or ALS and BLS, or what's the big deal? Don't we have ambulances already here in Medfield? We'll give you a little bit of background on that. We will describe the committee's recommendation that will be presented to the town at town meeting. That recommendation was passed when we had our committee meeting 4-2. So we had two people at the time who had a minority position that they wanted to present an alternative option, and we're going to give them the opportunity to do that as well. You should know about 3-4 days ago, one of the four who voted for the recommendation that we're going to present to you changed his mind and joined in the alternative. So right now, technically, although the official vote of the committee is 4-2, and the committee's recommendation is the one we're presenting, the actual current sentiment on the committee of the 6 voting members. We had 7, but Tom Marie dropped off. We didn't replace him. The sentiment is split 3-3. So tonight, because of that, we're also going to take some time to give you a chance to learn about that. What I'm going to suggest that we do from a process standpoint is I have a presentation we're going to go through that'll give you the background, and it will also provide you with the understanding of the committee's recommendation and the rationale, the economics behind that recommendation. We'll have a period where we'll accept questions of clarification. So the point would be, if you don't understand what the options are and you'd like a clarification of those options, we're going to do that. Then I'm going to turn the controls over to Steve. He's going to make a similar presentation for the alternative option. We will again have questions of clarification. And then from that point forward, no holds barred, all questions are open. We'll have a discussion until people get tired of asking questions, or we run out of answers, or there's a major disaster in town and all the people from the fire department need to leave, and it gets pretty boring with the rest of us who don't know what's going on. Okay? So let me go ahead and start. A little bit of background first. Over the past several years, the idea of advanced life support as the standard of care that should be provided to take care of people has come to the forefront. So you should understand what's happened here in emergency services is the overall expected standard of care has gone up. And we'll talk about what advanced life support means in a minute. When this standard first was raised, most of the towns around here all relied on an intercept service that was, I think in our case, was based out of Norwood Hospital. So basically Norwood Hospital sponsored a commercial ambulance service that would send out an ALS ambulance to wherever it was needed in the region to intercept with the town's own ambulance and provide support before the patient got to the hospital. And that worked for a number of years, and what would happen is every time you called for an ambulance, basically you paid the ambulance fee, or that ambulance fee was paid through insurance or Medicare or however it was paid, and it was just simply a kind of a pass-through cost that allowed us to get the service without having to do too much about it. Over time, Westwood, Walpole, and Norfolk all decided that they had enough demand for ALS calls that they decided that they would create their own ALS staff. So those 3 towns, actually more than those 3 towns, but of particular importance to us, those 3 towns all decided that they wanted to basically create their own organic ALS staff, and they brought their ALS needs in-house. When they did that, the private intercept service coming out of Norwood Hospital basically didn't have the demand and the calls that supported that business to be able to operate profitably as kind of a regional support. So Norwood discontinued that. What happened really a year and a half ago was that the company we were relying on until the fall of 2016, with I think it was 1 month's notice, less than 1 month, 2 weeks notice, basically said, we're going out of business, we're going away, it's done. And we kind of were left, so you've been hearing about ALS if you've been listening for about a year and a half here in town. We initially tried to team up with some other towns. If you step back far enough, you could probably make a pretty compelling case that towns like ours should regionalize, should join with other towns to pool a number of calls together that would be sufficient to kind of economically justify an ALS service. The problem is that as towns have made the decision to go ALS, the timing of those things has caused individual towns to make that decision. And as that happens, the opportunity to team with towns to come up with a combined solution gets less and less. So the real issue, I think in my experience with this effort, is the real issue is that the different towns decide they need ALS at different times, and when they look around to see who else needs ALS, the answer is nobody, because in some cases the towns are doing just fine getting support because their demands are small, and in other cases they've gone and already built their own capabilities. So we initially tried to band together with it seems to me a somewhat informal agreement with an ambulance service, looking at these, I think it was 4 towns that all came together and basically said, well, we'll support you 4 towns. So it was almost like a virtual regional capability, if you want to think of it that way. Within a relatively short period of time, that agreement fell apart. And I don't have all the details of why it fell apart. What I've heard, it fell apart because the parties on both sides didn't fully come through on what the expectations of the parties on the other sides thought. On the ambulance side, I think what that means is they weren't seeing the volume of calls that had been represented that they would see. And on the other side, I think it was probably that they weren't as responsive as people were expecting them to be. From the best that I have been able to determine from people who were there, Medfield followed through on its commitment. So it wasn't us that wrecked that agreement, but the agreement got wrecked all the same. So there we are, no good options in terms of building our own capabilities or tapping into anything. For the last year and a half, we have been relying on mutual aid. And this took me a while to, the folks in the fire department will say it's not really mutual aid. And I've said, yeah, it's mutual aid. It's like when your neighbor has an extra snowblower or has a snowblower and you have a lawnmower. It's not like everybody has to have a lawnmower and a snowblower. It kind of is a little bit. It's taken me 6 months, 7 months, 8 months to finally get my arms wrapped around this. But the idea of an ambulance service is every town has an ALS ambulance, and maybe some days they need two. So do you get two, or do you get three, or do you get four, or do you basically pool the resources? It's not a regional ambulance service, but it is a regional agreement that different towns will back up other towns with their ambulance. So in essence, you have access. Incidentally, I didn't mention this. I'm the chair. There's a basic rule in Medfield that the dumbest guy on a committee gets appointed chair. I am 2 for 2 on the committees that I'm on. So everything that I have to say here is a layperson's understanding picked up over 10 years who's a slow learner. And anyone in the fire department, anyone on the committee here that wants to correct me at any time, I think we have a ground rule. You already know you can do that. But I would specifically tell you that any of you who know better than what I'm saying, what really is correct. But this is what I understand about this. So the whole point is we basically have been relying on Westwood, Walpole, and I think to a lesser extent Norfolk to provide us with ALS support and will, for the foreseeable future. So it's been about a year and a half. And that's basically what our strategy has been so far. They understood they were helping us through an emergency period, kind of close the gap between when this thing dropped on our lap and when we finally figure out what we're going to do about it. But it's not a long-term solution. Very quickly, what is ALS? For anyone who doesn't know, basically it stands for Advanced Life Support. It is a level of emergency services that is above the BLS, Basic Life Support level. It involves paramedics providing more complex, to me, more intrusive treatments where it's needed. And by that, I mean things like intravenous insertions, tracheotomies, and things like that, that normal basic EMT would not be able to provide. So in essence, we're upping the game on what we can do before a patient gets to the hospital. There are 4 major areas, and I know for any of you who are paying attention on Facebook, there was a series of conversations going around about is BLS better or worse than ALS under certain circumstances. Everything I read was all around the cardiac side. And so that's one of 4 categories that ALS addresses. My own experience here in Medfield in terms of people that have talked to me is the third one, is the one that this town has people who have great concerns. People with young children. We have more residents, or we're very close if it's not still true. We used to at least have more residents under the age of 18 than any town in the state. I'm not 100% sure if we're actually number 1 in that category, but we are significantly heavier weighted toward people 18 and younger. So one of the issues for ALS here is actually with young families, with young children who perhaps have chronic conditions that occasionally lead to serious circumstances. ALS also allows for greater intervention in airway type situations. And also there's greater ability to administer pharmaceuticals. So those 4 areas are, when you think about ALS, that's what to think about. From a training standpoint, BLS, 140 hours of training, ALS, 1,800 hours of training. The average time to get a paramedic certification? 2 years. 2 years. So it's not it's a more extensive training regimen. You can look at the list. There's a lot more things that it takes to become a paramedic than just a basic EMT. And I just learned this. All of them are EMTs. So there's basic EMTs, there's paramedic EMTs, and I just learned that like last week. I've been doing this for 10 months, and it wasn't until about last week that I used paramedic and EMT, and I realized technically I wasn't quite right. Here's the committee. I mentioned who was on the committee. There were 7 voting members. There are 6. When Tom Marie stepped off, I could have asked for a replacement or tried to get a replacement. I elected not to, just because we were so deep into it, it didn't make a lot of sense to bring somebody new on. We have 3 non-voting members, Jeff Bonatti, who is a lieutenant here in this fire department, and Brendan and Christine. Technically, Brendan and Christine are not residents of Medfield, and technically people who aren't residents of Medfield can't vote. I think Christine's on virtually every committee that exists in Medfield, and I think on some of them she votes. And the real reason she lost the vote was when we wanted to go to 10. We didn't want to go to more people voting, so we kept 7 voting members. And Christine, I'm sure it broke her heart to have to step down and not be a voting member of this committee, but she stepped down. So that's what we've had. And I do want to call out both Chief Hollingshead, in Chief Carico's absence, or in the absence of any fire chief at all, as the voice of a fire chief representing a fire chief's perspective. He's done a tremendous job. And although he's not here, I want to recognize Sean Kay, who tried to get on this committee, who we didn't select. And I actually also want to recognize Jack Hunt over there, who also volunteered to be on this committee and he's actually been a source of advice for me personally over the course of this, which has been invaluable. But Sean, in particular, for the meetings, he started showing up even though he didn't get picked, and he started contributing. And I appreciate he did it, but it also is a lesson for anybody who's interested in being on a committee. Even if you don't get selected, that doesn't mean you can't come to these open meetings. And in fact, in a case like Sean's, he was a big contributor, regardless of the fact that he wasn't on the committee officially. And I appreciate that. The charter. We were asked coming out of the town meeting last year to study what it would take to bring ALS to Medfield. We were asked to explore all the options, look at regional service, look at private contracting, look at contracting with other towns. In other words, could we bribe Westwood or Walpole to just kind of be our ALS provider if we paid them enough money? What would it take to hire paramedics? What else could we do? And the way that we kind of define that in terms of from an operational standpoint, what did we do as a committee? We identified a full range of options. We did assess the interest of surrounding communities to collaborate with us. And the tough part on that one is that there are no communities of sufficient size and demand for calls to really have the incentive. We have the Sherborne Fire Chief with us here, and my perspective for both Sherborne and Dover is that for them right now, you're getting supported the way with just the normal pay-as-you-go. And so why would you want to throw a whole lot more money into something more formal? And it's just the way it works. Looking at what it would take if we did bring ALS in-house, looking at, do we actually really have a growing demand for emergency services? And I'm going to jump to that right now. Interestingly, from a historic standpoint, we have had a pretty steady call volume for, 15, 20 years. It's gone up and down from year to year, but it's been pretty steady. The reason I bring that up now is you all should understand this is not an initiative to increase the capacity of the fire department. This is an initiative to increase the level of service. When we go through some of the development that we're seeing over the next couple of years and the population goes up, maybe we'll see demand go up. But this is not a capacity issue that we're addressing, it's a quality of service issue. We largely, again, thanks to Brendan, we also were asked to take a look at the long-term economics, and in particular, try to get a good handle on the revenue side of this, because ambulance services in particular generate ambulance fees, and that's a big factor in figuring out what makes sense, whether you're paying those fees out or whether you're collecting those fees in. And then we were even asked, this was probably the hardest thing and the most ethereal thing, but the issue was with the evolution in emergency services and what's going on in the thinking about what does it take to provide emergency services in communities, where is that thinking headed? And if we go and commit to one particular solution, what does that do by way of implications for our ability to adjust to something that might change in the future that would call on us to do something different than we're doing right now? And we did take a look at that. And if anybody's curious, ask questions later on, and we can talk about that. So the planning assumptions and goals going into this that we took, first one is that the level of ALS service will not be worse than the intercept service that we had from Norwood Hospital. That was kind of like a bottom line. We don't want to be going backwards. As a committee chair, what that really means for me from a practical standpoint, this committee did not start off with the question, should Medfield have ALS or not? We started off with saying, what would it take for us to have ALS at or above the level that we've been historically enjoying for several years? So if you want to have a philosophical debate about that ALS versus BLS, this is the wrong committee. You've got the wrong people here, and we just spent 10 months doing the wrong thing, if that's your question. We understood that this is not a 50-year solution. This may be a 50-year building, but what we're talking about here is not a 50-year solution. We're hoping that this is an answer that looks reasonable for the town for the next 5 to 10 years, and then we move in whatever directions the trends are going to call on us to move. And then the other thing, as a former warrant committee member and a 3-year chair of the warrant committee, I'm all on board with the idea that what we're trying to do is to find a solution that gets us ALS services, but does it in as economical a way as we possibly can. And we didn't know when we set that we were going to be headed into a budget year that's going to look like what you're going to see on Monday night. But I can tell you, I think that's an even more important assumption that we took going forward from here. That's the basic background. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn this over to Chief Hollingshead, and he's going to talk a little bit about a little more technical side of this.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for being here tonight. Obviously, Chief Carrico here, my short career in Medfield as the interim chief is almost over. It's been a pleasure. One of the neat things I've learned about it's a phenomenal community, phenomenal fire department, both the paid and the on-call folks. And one of the most important things I've learned from the citizens out there is that they've been very happy, very impressed with the levels of service that the firefighters provide to the community. Coming through the doors, just part of the family per se. And I think that's a direction that, from my perspective, and the committee and their ultimate recommendation in the bringing aboard 4 additional firefighter paramedics, is that we look at that in the sense that you're going to continue to get the same service from the people that that you trust, that they're going to come into your homes and provide, as Gus mentioned, a higher level of service to you folks, okay? A little bit about the fire department. There are 8 full-time, and you'll see the personnel chart shortly, but there are 8 full-time firefighters. There are 2 firefighters on each shift that are on the shift 24 hours a day. There are 15 call firefighters who do a phenomenal job. In fact, John is here just do a phenomenal job in supporting the community, supporting the fire department, and really making the system work. And I think that's important to realize, is that Medfield, ALS, BLS is part of a system. Mutual aid areas, and also out of Norwood Hospital and some of the other surrounding systems. So we really want to be part of that system. Gus had mentioned mutual aid, so that we're always calling for ALS, and we cannot provide ALS back, okay? So it's a mutual system. Not like the fire trucks in one of the surrounding towns has a good-sized fire, or we have one. We can call, we can give and receive, so it's a real mutual system. So I think you ought to be commended for the fire department that you have here, but I think times are changing in this direction, okay? As I mentioned, there are dual roles. The firefighter paramedics that, if this proposal goes through, they are having 2 roles. They're not just paramedics. They are firefighter paramedics. They will go on every call. They're not sitting back waiting for ALS calls. They will be on a fire truck or in the ambulance, and they will go on every call. And during that process, they'll determine if it's an ALS call, whatever. But you always have those people on board here. As I mentioned, there are 8 full-time firefighters, 2 per shift. Presently, there are 2 paramedics that are certified by the state on a department. There is 1 advanced EMT, which is a little bit in the middle. They can have some skills, but they're not at the full paramedic level yet. And there are 5 basic EMTs. Some of the initial framework, when you think about this process, and I hate to put dollars and cents onto things, but it's a very important issue here in the community. But when we look at the service deliverables here, kind of 3 areas in regards to emergency medical services, whether it's BLS or ALS. The first part is dispatch, the initial classification of the call. As we move forward in this process, we can improve the dispatch protocols. And jumping ahead relative to the billing aspect of things, if we do that, how a call is received and how it's dispatched, it gets classified as an ALS call. We can bill at that ALS rate. So when the firefighter paramedics from Medfield Fire show up and determine that it's not a full ALS call per se, we can still bill the insurance companies at that certain dispatch level. So it gives us some flexibility in tightening that up a little bit. The intercept treatment is the actual level, and our statistics here in this community are very good relative to response times, dispatch. We can put somebody in your front door in less than 4 minutes. We have stats that we track all those kind of things. When you think about that, being able to put a firefighter, put the ambulance, put the EMTs at your front door in the average of 4 minutes, that's pretty impressive, going through all the stats relative to cardiac events, oxygen loss to the brain, and all those other ALS-related issues. And transport, delivering the patient to the hospital. Again, not to put the business side, but that's where the dollars and cents comes into play. That's where the money is relative to transporting people. And one of the issues that in the present system that we have right now, if we do an intercept with Westwood or Walpole, what happens is that from the recoverable amount of money, so just for numbers' sake, if we bill an ambulance ride for, let's say it's $1,000, but Medicare only reimburses us $600, then we have to split that $600 with Westwood if they're doing the intercept, or with Walpole. So Medfield's only actually bringing in the $300 in that respect. So we are losing X number of dollars on every ALS intercept that we hook up with. Okay, so the 3 basic levels with that. I'm going to throw this back to Gus for a minute or two. It goes back to a little bit of the history, and I'll be back in a minute.
Thanks, Chief. I mentioned that one of the things we were asked to do was to take a look at options. And early on in the committee's efforts, we identified 3. We actually started with one option, which was the one that was put on the table a year ago, which was to build the internal staff. So that independent route is Medfield developing its own staff. When the numbers a year or so ago first got put on the table, I think the first number that showed up was $750,000, and of that $750,000, about $150,000 was for capital equipment. Fairly shortly after that, before we got to last year's town meeting, the total capital cost was reduced significantly from that. It was closer to $100,000, but we were still looking at a total cost of about $600,000 to build the paramedic staff here in Medfield. What the committee has been able to do, and it's not as magical as it might look here, but I'll tell you where the magic came in. The first thing that the committee did was we actually, in terms of a concept, said, well, not a full 8 new paramedics, but rather if we added 4 more paramedics and could convert some, then we could get to 8 paramedics without having to double the size of the fire department staff. So that's how we got down to that first revision, and then the second revision we'll get into in more depth. But when we started to look more rigorously at the revenue side of this, we were able to drive the net cost of the town even further. So right now, that number one, which is the current recommendation, just so you know, that cloud is, you got to use the top edge of the cloud. It's at 250. We spent some time exploring opportunities to collaborate, and I'm glad Chief Kerry's here because he talked with us several times, and I think it would be fair to say that in both Sherborne and Dover, the philosophical predisposition would be, yes, is there a good way for us to collaborate? But the practical side of that in terms of, and this is us talking, so you can carry it back or disagree, but our looking at that was there was not sufficient motivation in either one of those towns, because right now those towns, just like we used to have the option of just relying on getting support from neighboring communities and just paying as you go. So anything that's going to build in a recurring cost for some sort of infrastructure just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So it was a possibility. If we could have gotten there, perhaps the price could have gotten down pretty low. The problem is we can't find any partners with both the sufficient size to make it economically attractive for an ambulance service and the sufficient proximity that don't already have their own ALS, like say Millis. We don't have anybody to team up with that is going to let us get there. So that's a dark cloud because there's risk associated with it, even though theoretically it sounds like a good thing. And a lot of people have said we need to regionalize. It's like, you know, we got to regionalize with Worcester or something because we're not going to find anybody right close to us right now that wants to do it. The other one was the obvious one, which was to outsource. To be honest, when I joined this committee to begin with, I assumed I was going to be in favor of outsourcing because I assumed that the price for outsourcing and the price for building our own was kind of like where that top cloud is on the left and where that cloud is on the right. I really did expect that that's where we were going to get, just as a way to play for time until you can figure things out. Outsourcing basically is at the very least $600,000 a year to hire an ambulance service. It's just so you have some sense, and these are oversimplifications from somebody who isn't in emergency services. We have around 300 calls a year. If you want to, I'm using some easy numbers. If you wanted to get the town of Middleborough has free private ambulance service, does it for free, just for the ambulance fees, and their volume is 3,000 calls a year. So in terms of understanding why that might work, if we had people that were sicker or fell out of trees more often or exited their houses on the second floor all the time, we might also be able to get up to 3,000 calls a year, but we just haven't been able to do that. We're kind of hanging around that 300 call level. So what happens is if you get to high call volumes, then the price for private ambulance services go down. This is purely my unqualified view. But as we've talked about private ambulance services, in my head, I'm saying that a private ambulance service it won't make sense for a private ambulance service to provide service unless they can find a way to generate at least $750,000 between whatever the town pays and whatever ambulance fees they collect. So any way you're trying to get below that and get an ambulance, you're wasting your time. So that's the outsource side. When we looked at where the outsource side was going in terms of total cost to the town and compared it to where we were at with the recommendation that the committee came up with, you can see why we wound up with the recommendation the committee came up with. Now, I'm biasing this a little bit because Steve is going to make a case for why that's not necessarily the most attractive. So just in all fairness, I'm setting him up to make this harder, as hard as I possibly can. But that at least explains the rationale for why we got to the committee recommendation that we got to. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Just another quick point of clarification when Gus mentions the ambulance service. We talk about intercept service. If the town decides to go for the private side and they talk about intercept service, that is not an ambulance. You will not be receiving an ambulance from a private entity. The intercept service would be two paramedics in a chase vehicle or an SUV, whatever the private entity sets up. They will intercept with the Medfield ambulance, so they will get on board and do their things, and Medfield will still transport. Now, depending on how that flies, as far as the separations of dollars and cents, who gets what, whatever, that would have to be worked out. When we talked right now about private entity, that's an intercept service. It's not an ambulance. Right now they would be using Medfield's ambulance and one or two of Medfield's personnel to be in that, okay? So the current, jumping a little bit back to the fire department, right? This is the present situation. There are 8, like I said, 8 full-time firefighters, the 4 shifts with 2 EMT firefighters and paramedics, plus the 16 on-call firefighters. This in no way will look to eliminate or change the call firefighters' role in this community. In fact, we talked about, we're looking at staffing and looking at the number of call firefighters and maybe improving that and all that. So the program here is not going to affect that. The call firefighters play a very important role here in Medfield. Presently, you're certified at the BLS level, the basic life support. The intercepts are handled through dispatch and also the firefighter EMTs at a call. If they get to a certain call and they realize it needs to be elevated, they will call back to dispatch, and dispatch will notify a mutual aid town, Westwood or Walpole or Norfolk, and then they will send their ambulance to intercept. Sometimes you might see the 2 towns on the side of 109. Well, that's, you are seeing an intercept there. Westwood or Walpole is coming. Our ambulance is stopping. The 2 medics, paramedics from Westwood or Walpole would get in the back of the ambulance, do an assessment, do their thing, and then the 2 ambulances would head over to Norwood. Right? As we talked about, primarily through Westwood, Norfolk, and Walpole. Medfield is not the primary choice for ambulance mutual aid, because for the most part, the surrounding towns here are all advanced level. They're at ALS, except for Dover and Sherborne. So the Millis, the Norfolks, the Cantons, and the Westwoods, they're not going to call Medfield for mutual aid because their service is at a certain level and ours is at the basic level. Sir?
When you say their service, you're talking about the firefighters of those towns or all ALS? Or are you talking about the ambulance service?
I can't give you the exact numbers, but they're firefighter EMTs and firefighter paramedics. They serve the dual role in Westwood and Walpole as well. Exactly. So they're those towns, as is Norfolk and Millis is trying to head in that direction, they are getting the 2-for-1 per se, the firefighter paramedics. So when we say we do it in-house for the control, you're talking about improving fire service delivery, and I'll show you that in 1 second, okay? The recommended course of action from the vote of the committee was to actually look to hire 4 additional firefighter paramedics. As Gus had mentioned, this wasn't designed to add staffing. It was designed to improve the quality of service that you folks deserve on a regular basis, okay? So we look at that. The ultimate goal here would be at 8 paramedics. For the state licensing, there's about a 3-year process. There's a 3-year window that we can work in as far as building the full ALS system, in which advanced life support, in which that we would control the quality assurance, the programs that we have in-house at Norwood Hospital and also the state. That's a system that we here in Medfield, the new fire chief, would control along with Lieutenant Bernardi, who's the EMS coordinator here. So how do we get to that? Obviously, we have 2 paramedics right now on staff. If we hire 4, obviously we're going to get to the 6. Now, okay, we say we need 2 more. There is a pending retirement within a couple of years. So part of our hiring process is to make sure that any future hiring in Medfield is hiring a firefighter paramedic. So we build the system ultimately through attrition, whatever it might be. So we're going to hire paramedics beyond that, which gets us to 7. So there's some contract negotiations that are ongoing relative to some incentive for some of the on-duty EMTs to go to paramedic school, which would get us to 8. Once we have 8, we can get fully licensed by the state to provide a full ALS system. So Norwood Hospital and the state also understands there's a transition period. So part of that transition period is that on certain ALS calls, certain advanced life support calls, if a shift only has, until we get to the full 8, if a shift only has 1 paramedic, on certain calls, the doctors established that we need to call and intercept from Westwood of Walpole. So until we're full ALS and 2 paramedics per shift, there might be a shift or 2, depending upon the staffing levels, in which a certain advanced life support call comes in that we would still call Westwood and Walpole. That's just a short-term fix per se, but what that does, it meets the requirements of Norwood Hospital Medical Control and also the state. Excuse me. The one other thing that Gus and I talk about is this extra position here, not really extra, but it's a supernumerary in which 5 or 6 years down the road, depending upon how the system plays out, there's the potential for a period of time to have 13 personnel on the fire department, pending some attrition, however it works out. We don't think that that's going to be an issue, but we want the public to know that 5 or 6 years down the road, there is the potential for the staffing to be from 12 to 13. That shouldn't be permanent at that time, but we just want that on the table, that depending upon how the system bills, that you understand that, and that's that position right here.
Chief, could I, just so, this is the warrant committee guy now talking, just so you understand what that means. We have 6 EMTs, one is retiring, that one's a replacement. This is saying if over the next 5 or 6 years, not a single one of the existing EMTs either leaves and we replace them or wants to convert to being a paramedic, over 5 or 6 years, that could happen. It's not that there's any intention to do that, and I actually would think that right now I don't think there's a very high likelihood that that would happen. You should know that the town is doing everything it can to encourage, incentivize, and reward existing EMTs who are interested in doing that. So it's not just a passive thing. We want to try to. We'd rather keep the people we have, quite frankly, if we can.
Sure.
If there are 2 paramedics on the ambulance, who's driving the ambulance? Is one of the paramedics?
That's a very good question, and I'll tell you why. The state law requires us to have 2 paramedics. You're going to have one driving and one in the back. So in the event if there's a problem at the call, and I'm going to show you how we deal with that with fire department staffing in a second. State requires 2. One's going to be in the front, one's in the back. But part of the thing is that, and which separates paramedics from EMTs, all due respect to the EMTs in the room. Paramedic skill is about diagnostics. They are doing that screening, that diagnostic skill that they've learned and trained on at your house. So if there are 2 paramedics that are going to show up and walk into the door, per se, they do their thing, and if they feel comfortable with one paramedic being in the back, the other one would drive, and everything kind of goes in a good way. If we move forward relative to staffing and adding a 3rd firefighter paramedic to each shift, if the call is not an ALS call, what we can do is take that 2nd paramedic off, send him or her back to the station, send the EMT to drive the ambulance. The 3 firefighters would go to the call. That 3rd medic would come back to the station. So if we ultimately build the system relative to ALS, we would actually be sending that paramedic back here because the call is not at one of those real priority calls per se. So we look at shifting the benefits of increasing the staffing levels from 2 to 3. It gives us flexibility. The first one is, well, as a 2 responder call, we would send 3 firefighters to that call to make the determination. It helps with the lifting, the carrying the patient out of the house, getting information, getting medications in a bedroom, whatever it might be. Having that 3rd set of hands who's familiar with the system gives us flexibility. And like I said, it's not a real high priority call. That 2nd medic can come back here and be ready to go on another call. We build a system, we can build an ALS engine or whatever down the road. Some of the tools and equipment could be on an engine, but that's really down the road. It just gives us flexibility. As far as the medical emergency, it's a faster response. We talk about survival, improved survival probability, and also if severe cardiac or traumatic event if we have the three show up, if the three full-time firefighters are on duty, then we put the third EMT, we put that EMT driving, and we put the two paramedics in the back. So it improves the service. So we're not waiting for other people or other ambulances to show up. We're dealing with it directly in a matter of minutes, and we're improving the system and getting the patient to the closest hospital. So going from 2 to 3 improves the EMS delivery quite extensively. From the firefighting perspective, it's been very interesting coming here and looking at how we deliver fire service here. Historically, that third set of hands make a tremendous difference initially on the fire ground. It gives us assistance, but also allows that third person relative to lifting, prevents injuries, minimizes back injuries, minimizes costs, minimizes liability to the community. But just having that multi-purpose firefighter EMT paramedics, it just improves the overall fire service delivery system, fire service and ALS system, in my mind, tremendously, okay? One final point relative to this. Very interesting decision folks will have here in Medfield. And I firmly believe in a biased opinion because of my background relative to the managing and the control of the system. These are your firefighter paramedics. We look at them, we manage, we can control quality assurance, remediation, training, all those kind of things that we manage internally. And I think that folks here in Medfield have been quite happy with the fire service and what these folks have done. And I think the future is great relative to improving the service that I think you folks need and appreciate. Sir.
Thanks, Chief.
Okay, so then there's the price tag. So I'm going to cover that in a minute. I wanted to just, in getting into that, I wanted to make a comment. If you haven't yet read your town warrant, or you haven't been paying attention to what the storm clouds are looking like for next Monday's town meeting, the numbers that I've seen, if the town were to approve everything that everybody wants, special articles, department requests, and all of that stuff, the total overrides that would be required would be in excess of $3 million. So that doesn't mean that's where I think we're headed, but that's what it would come out to be. By my own handicapping in terms of looking at and this is just my opinion, which you could take or leave, but I tend to, having spent time on the warrant committee, I take a pretty hard-nosed look at the town spending at a rate faster than people's incomes are going up, I guess would be the way to look at it. By my own handicapping right now and trying to figure out which things I think maybe we really ought to do and which things should we just ignore, we're at least at $1 million override. And I'll tell you that this is part of my $1 million, so you can draw your own conclusions. So this is all carrying out in a much broader context of decisions you're going to be making on Monday night at the town meeting, maybe Tuesday night at the town meeting, depending on how this all goes. And I think we're all very mindful of that, but you should be thinking about that. There's one more thing I'll comment here before I get to the numbers, and this applies to both options. I already told you this committee was asked to figure out how to bring ALS to Medfield. So both options that you are going to see are bringing ALS to Medfield. As part of the investigation that we did, we went to Westwood and Walpole, and we said, well, what if we just decide we kind of like what you're doing for us, and we'd just like to keep it up for another year. Would you be willing to continue to provide us with ALS support over, for, I don't know, another year, and however long? And we got an answer, no. So you need to understand that the real decision that you're making, first and foremost, is does Medfield have ALS or not? And then the second question that you're going to answer is which way do you think is the best way for Medfield to get ALS? But those are two very important questions, and the two options you're going to see today are both starting from the premise that we're getting ALS. The darker or the harder question, or the starker question, is do you want ALS or not? Okay. So a couple points. First off, this is the first time you have seen any department or any committee present labor costs in a full-up manner. So what normally happens is when a request comes in to hire somebody, you'll see the salary cost in the department that that person is being hired into. But in fact, one of the things that's causing us heartache on our budgets this year is that we have town-wide employee benefits accounts. So the health care accounts, the Medicare accounts, the retirement, active employee retirement, those all, for all departments, are carried in a town-wide account. And in many ways you could say, well, retirement, health care, those aren't really costs that we get to control. We can control them by what our head count is, certainly, but we don't get to control whether the health care costs go up at a certain rate. This year, the town is facing, or for FY19, the coming year, the town is facing over a $700,000 increase in those townwide budgets. So when we talk about $1 million overruns, when you realize this is 700,000-pound elephant that just landed that we can't control really in any reasonable ways, that's why this, it's a big piece of why this is so painful this year, just going into it. So what we did here with this paramedic labor cost model, and we looked, because again, there's a contract under negotiation, we are using current rates. So any of you who are wanting to anticipate what things go, use whatever percentage increase from year to year you want to these rates. But basically, what we did is we looked at the breakout of direct fire department budget costs. So this is the money on the fire department salary line, and that came out to $81,377. So $82,000. We then looked at the cost for the townwide budget, and that's workers' comp, Medicare, and health insurance. The way we built in the health insurance is we assumed 2 out of the 4 new paramedics would take full family coverage. That's an assumption that's higher than what our actual experience is for 2 reasons. Number one, the participation rate isn't that high, and not all town employees take out family coverage. So that's actually presumably on the high side, unless we just happen to find the 3 or 4 paramedics with families who want health care from Medfield. But based on experience, we estimated that at 50% of full family coverage. That's another $11,000 a paramedic. And then over on the next, over there is the unfunded long-term cost, which is pension costs and OPEB. The other committee I'm on is the OPEB trust fund. So OPEB is other post-employee benefits. That's when we offer health care to retirees, particularly before they go on Medicare. The town has to pay for that. And what's happening now is the Government Accounting Standards Board is properly tightening up the standards or the expectations for states and cities and other municipalities to recognize their long-term obligations. That doesn't show up on a budget. That shows up in a long-term financial obligation calculation. That's about, it's $4,800, let's call it $5,000 a year there. That last column over there is protective clothing. That's $3,200 in capital, one-time capital expense. We didn't include that in the number that you have at the top there. So basically we said the full-up cost for a paramedic based on this year's rates is $97,000. Make that $100,000. Now let me then give you the simple, easy to remember calculation, then I'll show you the details. 4 paramedics, $100,000 each, $400,000 in increased cost to the town. $320,000 of that, when we have 4 paramedics on board full-time for a full year, is $320,000 into the fire department budget. There's another $60,000 when we have 4 paramedics here full-time that is going to go toward the town-wide budgets. And then there's another $20,000 that is basically what we probably should be putting into increased OPEB contributions. That's the cost driver. We're going up $400,000. The increased revenue from the town having an ALS capability, I believe conservatively estimated, and I'll show you how we get to that number, and Brendan will fill in all the details if I get any of it wrong, is $150,000 in increased revenues. So $400,000 up, $150,000 to the good down, leaves us with a net of $250,000 cost to the town. That is the price tag for what we're recommending here. That's the number that you'll see that's initial, at least with the article as it will first be presented, Article 16. That will be the number of the requested operating override to support ALS. Okay. Now let me give you the details. So Here we have, in adding 4 paramedics, this is, Brendan, and you have to understand, some of the numbers won't be exactly what I just said because we did some of these calculations at different points in time when we were using estimating numbers that were slightly different. So we had estimated the increased cost for the paramedics was $388,000. That's my $400,000 number. The increase in the revenue of the town was $145,000. That relates to the $150,000 number that I just gave you. The net cost to the town, $243,000. That's the $250,000 I gave you. But I'm only showing you this so you know that we didn't just kind of wing it or use order of magnitude estimates. Only because Brendan was here and had the cost models to do it, we were doing a pretty, and Christine was able to pull the details out of our cost accounting system. We were doing reasonably rigorous calculations of what this would all cost. The next column over, this was me only because nobody wasn't willing to argue with me about it. I said in the first year when we were looking to hire 4 paramedics, where do we drive the stake? We're not going to have them full-time for the full year. What do we think is going to happen? I said, well, why don't we assume that we're going to have them on average here for half a year each, so we'll have the equivalent of 2 full-time paramedics. That was just me because I don't know any better to do anything different. So let's assume half the cost in the first year, half the revenues in the first year. Basically, we need around $190,000 for the fire department and the townwide budgets in the first year. The override being requested is $250,000, and that was because the accountant, the treasurer, and the principal assessor in town felt that we should claim the full override that we think it's going to take. I argued with them for a couple hours, but they wanted to claim the full override this year. So in essence, what we're doing is we're requesting the complete override that this requires this year, although technically we need about $190,000 of it this year based on that arbitrary 50% cut. Yeah.
Is there another slide that'll talk about the expenditures for the capital, for the equipment?
We didn't. No, we didn't. So the expenditures for capital, somewhere on the order of $100,000 was in my head one-time expenditure. These are all recurring costs. Chief, you may want to talk
Absolutely.
a little bit about where we're at on that. So yeah.
A couple of quick points to that. I like Gus, he always shoots high. Honestly, we're about $67,000 to $70,000 for our capital. In all honesty, grants and donations, I think, are going to take care of that quite extensively. So that's why it's not included in that as well. Well, before I finish, in all honesty, it's been a pleasure working with the committee, the ALS committee. I've been here since September, and I thought that they uncovered every single rock that they possibly could have relative to options and making this thing work. They ought to be commended for their efforts. And my apologies to call firefighter Bobby Bond in the back. I just noticed him, very active, been around a long time. We appreciate his efforts. And Bobby, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Chief. One more insider. Seeing as there's so many people from the fire department here, speaking as former ward committee member, that $70,000, Chief, you need to know this too. That $70,000, it's not in the override. Now, they had a reason for it not being in the override. My reason is because I want to squeeze the fire department and have them come up with the $70,000 to pay for it. So I'm not going to argue about trying to get it built in. I want it squeezed out. But that's just me as a board committee member and maybe selectman.
But along those lines, if I may, you have the 2 ambulances. So the ambulance, the hard copy is there per se. So it's just some of the minor, I would say minor, but some of the equipment to take it to the ALS level.
Martha?
I'm just having looked at the budget, I would just be surprised if there's 70,000 hidden that the one hasn't found in the past.
So when you find it, so when the fire department finds it, don't make a big deal about it because Martha's a great person. We don't want to embarrass. In fairness, one of the things that we didn't include in the cost estimate was any kind of a projection about any kind of overtime savings. So if we've had 2 people on a shift, pretty much if one's gone, you've got to bring somebody on. With 3 people on a shift, it's up to the fire chief on whether the circumstances would require all 3 to be replaced. So the thought was, and this is you wouldn't have known this because you didn't get a vote, but the thought was, that, at least on my part, that there might be the possibility with 3 people on a shift that you wouldn't need the overtime in all cases the way you would with 2 people on a shift. And I'll find out in a year, or maybe the next time I talk to Chief Carrico, exactly how wrong or right I might be on that. Yeah. Okay. So that's that. Just so you kind of get a sense of how things break out here, when we go to ALS, one of the issues here is that Brendan took a look at the way that we classified calls now and recognized that if we change some things around our dispatch procedures, we would literally classify some calls differently, so our distribution of calls between BLS calls and ALS calls would shift. This distribution here is not our current distribution. This is Brendan's projection of what that distribution would be if we were changing our dispatch procedures to legitimately classify some calls that can legitimately be classified ALS if we started doing that in a way that we haven't been doing. If we do that, we pick up, in the estimate, at least $50,000 in increased revenues, because as Chief Hollingshead said, if you classify a call as ALS, the ambulance fee associated with that call is at a higher rate than BLS. I am, again, totally unqualified on this, but for example, somebody calls and says, my child fell out of the tree and I don't think they're breathing. That's an ALS call. If by the time they fell out of the tree, they had the wind knocked out of them, and between the time the call was made and the time the parent gets out there, they've caught their breath and they're breathing again, and by the time the ALS ambulance shows up for the stopped breathing child that fell out of the tree and turns out it's only a twisted ankle and the kid's fine, it's an ALS call. Or more or less. At least you get the concept. I don't know if I've quite got that technically right, but you get the concept? So that's why that works that way, and the term, why it's allowed, is the cost of readiness. So the state recognizes that if you're going to have this capability, you should be able to recover the cost of doing it, and so that's the rule that's in place. That's the $50,000. The $85,651 represents the ALS ambulance fees for intercept and in some cases transport that we are sending out to Westwood, Walpole, and I guess to a lesser extent Norfolk. Once we become ALS, we may be sending them some money when we're getting mutual aid from them, but they're going to send us money when we're giving mutual aid to them. So that becomes a wash. We pull that $85,000 back in. And Chief, we think we modestly guessed that between Dover and Sherborne, if we were ALS, we might actually have $25,000 in ambulance fees over a given year in providing ALS support to Dover and Sherborne. So that was how we modeled that piece. You add those all up, you get to $160,000. We only called it $150,000. So there's in most cases, when we estimated on the revenue side, we went down, on the cost side, we went up, except for things like we didn't try to accelerate the basic rates for what inflation we get. Yep.
I'm sorry. It sounds like what you're saying is that currently we're undercoding our calls that are ALS and we're not coding them as ALS. In the future, we're going to upcode. So currently we're downcoding and undercoding.
I wouldn't say we're downcoding, but we're screening them just a little bit differently.
It's the same exact calls.
Correct.
We're undercoding it or overcoding it next year.
Correct.
One of those two things is happening, right?
Yes.
So we're undercoding.
If you look at it that way, it depends.
We don't provide ALS, so we can't overcode it.
You can call. So right now, I'm sorry. When you get a call right now, someone's not breathing. You're not coding that as an ALS call.
I'm not 100%. I don't.
Yes.
I don't know.
You are.
Mm-hmm. Chief Meany, dispatchers up there on the police
Okay, so
department.
dispatch runs under the police.
Okay.
So basically, what we're doing right now is if we get that call for the child that fell out of the tree, we're sending out Medfield's A1 with the 2 basic EMTs on it, and we're just calling whoever. We're calling Walpole, we're calling Norfolk, we're calling Westwood, because that sounds very ALS to us. If we get a call that we have a child who is fallen in the backyard and appears to have a leg injury. Okay, we're going to do that as a ELS call. They may get down there and find out that, yeah, he fell in the yard, but he fell from 10 feet up the tree. Now it shifts to ALS. And then the absolute honest truth about this is we are trying to use Westwood and Walpole and Norfolk the least amount of times we can. We don't want to get them over here on a regular basis. Sorry, we didn't need you. So there are times when these calls absolutely, if we had the system, would be ALS calls. No two ways about it. But we will call A1 and say, here's a scenario. Do you want medics or do you want to assess? And then they'll give us this, send medics. Nope, we're going to assess. And, you know, most of the time it works out okay. But I'm going to tell you, that's a little bit of a roll of the dice. It really is. Because we all know, anyone who's ever answered a phone in a public safety building or at a hospital or anything like that, what you hear on the phone may be quite different than what you find when you get there. And it could be much worse, it could be much simpler. So that's the honest thing of how we're doing dispatch right now. We are going downwards a little bit so that we don't overuse the good graces of Walpole and Westwood and have them say, Medfield, can you please just back off a little bit? We've been there 4 times today. So that's what we've been trying to do. And we work with, you know, the folks on A1 and we have a conversation right in the radio. You want medics, you want to assess, and we go back and forth in the air about that.
Okay. So I
It's
was
something
reading-
that I don't feel real comfortable about, but
Right.
it's what, you know, it's what we have to do to get the job done
And
right now.
there were a lot of things that come into that answer. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the article, you're going to see if you brought your warrant report, this is the exact wording of the article. The requested override for this article that the committee is putting forward is a $250,000 override. And in particular, this year, we're going to be using $190,000 of it. I want to point out, in a second here, Steve will do a little bit of questions and clarification, then I'm going to hand this over to you. But I want to point out one thing about the article as it's worded. This article does not, in its own wording, prescribe that we will hire paramedics in accordance with the request that we have. The committee's put forward to do this internally for this override amount. In the case, what you're going to hear from Steve is an alternative that involves private ambulance service. The wording of this article is worded to accommodate that as well, if that's, it has more to do probably ultimately with the approved funding request to come right down to it. So for anybody who's wondering, well, how will both of these options, they actually would fit the way this is worded. Okay? So with that, Steve, what I'm going to do, if you want to get set up, you can just pull my plug there, and that's all yours. And then, are there any questions or clarification around the, yes? And I forgot one thing, Christine, you'd asked me to have people, because this is a public meeting, it's being published, could you just say who you are and give us your address?
Sure, I'm Catherine Thorpe and I'm at 115 South Street.
Thank you.
And my question was in regard to, you were saying, more of a clarification of, you said this wouldn't affect the call department at all. And I was confused about that because if you said if we go directly, once this comes into effect, whenever that happens, if we approve what has been suggested, then we would have 3 on immediately going out. So then wouldn't that in effect you wouldn't need call department unless it was, you know, maybe like a legitimate, like full-blown fire or whatever, because I think you need, how many do you need? You need 3 to go out?
You're way over my head, so I'm going to, let me sit down.
So that was like sort of my concern, because I feel like it would definitely directly and immediately affect the call department.
I would disagree with that because depending upon the call and the need for extra personnel with helping and lifting and all those kind of things, and they've done it historically here relative to what we call striking a box for extra help, and that's where they would come in. As far as the day-to-day and the normal routines, nothing is going to change in that respect relative to the call firefighters, their responses. We're not looking to change the running cards per se relative to the call department and how they respond.
But if you had 3 going out, right, if you have 3 on,
Correct.
why would you need to call the call department right away? Like, why would you have to strike a box right away?
Correct.
So wouldn't it affect them right away? Like what would, like, I mean, it doesn't make sense to me.
I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
If you look at it from that perspective, there's a limited number of calls where that could be true, okay? But in the bigger scheme of things, their overall numbers are not gonna change. They're still gonna be, coming to.
So for like car accidents?
Correct. Absolutely.
So like
That's-
if you would wait to send out, you would have them be at the desk, or would you have them sent out? Or
Correct,
you would
and
wait for them?
that's why you have four very talented lieutenants to make those decisions. They go to an accident on 109, they know it's too cut from the report they get, they're gonna strike the box, they're gonna start to help already.
But in the long term though, when you were saying that, like in 5 to 10 years, if we go that long, where you said, I think the number 13, right?
Correct, you only,
That, like, if we look at that, how would that call, I mean, it's basically let's be honest, is it the phasing out of the call department? Because if you get to that number 13, there's no way that you would need a call department.
okay. I love going down the fire side of things, okay? Let me go down that path,
Okay.
The fire department is based upon certain national standards, requirements, and we talk about these kinds of things relative to, and I'll be honest, liability and insulating the community against liability. There's certain standards in which require 14 firefighters on scene for a reported structure fire. That's 14. That's a minimum of 14 tasks. The reason they say that there's 14, because the standard is that there are 14 potential simultaneous actions that have to occur at a fire incident.
A working
okay?
fire. Yeah.
Correct, or it
Okay.
could be smoke in the building, whatever it might be.
Okay.
Those standards do not go away. Medfield, as we're presently staffed, cannot afford to deal with eliminating the call fire department. We've talked about it, and we've tried to reassure people that cannot happen here in Medfield. You're not going to increase the staffing of your fire department to such a level that it's going to eliminate the call
Right.
firefighters.
It might not be eliminated, but it won't be utilized as much. There's a difference, right? Like it won't be eliminated. You'll never say, we're not having a call department anymore, but it won't be utilized as much as what you're saying.
I honestly, from my opinion,
Yeah.
I think that'd be very minimal. Rest assured that that's not gonna change the overall approach. Not at all. They still have a very active and important role here in the community for the long term. I know it's a fear and I know it's out there in that whole discussion.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
appreciate your clarification, because it was just, when you look at it that way, it's just hard to.
I guess, and I don't come from the fire side, but I got a question. If the 2 firefighters are on right now, and none of us are in this building, and a fire call happens, do they leave in the fire truck?
Yes, they do.
So if there's a 3rd firefighter, they leave in the fire truck?
Yes, they do.
So today's standard of 2 leaving in a fire truck has no effect on the call department ever getting here.
Correct.
Adding a 3rd person doesn't change that.
Correct.
So I don't think there's any net difference.
From today, right?
Correct.
I mean, I'm just thinking on the fire side, that, yeah, if it goes out and they get in the truck and drive away, then the chance is still the same for the call guys to still
That's
get here and
correct.
take the second.
Can I,
I would think it'd be the same.
so one other thing too, is, are you thinking that if we got a motor vehicle crash, and, we need help,
Yeah.
which my guys are gonna do that, a lot of times we just put the box on. So are you thinking that all 12 or potentially 13 of the full-time firefighters will be coming back?
Well, that is another question, like, are we, within the hiring process too, like, say, like, that's, right, so you would need the call, because you're obviously, people are gonna be living
we
all
go.
over the place. So
And
I
that's-
do understand that.
And so
I
that's the
just-
thing, so that those 13 or 14 you're getting,
Right.
he's not getting those from the full-time folks.
Right.
We need to call people.
Yeah.
And I'll put it, I'm 64, and until the dirt is put on top of my chest, which I'm really hoping is not, this call fire department is gonna exist, absolutely positively,
Yeah.
without question. It can't go anywhere.
Yeah.
It
no, I
can't,
appreciate
we don't have the financial resource to pull that one off. Not forever.
Sure.
You retire in a year, right?
I have to. I might go sooner, Jack,
You won't have any authority
over,
to call firefighters.
oh, I don't now.
When you call a call, you send 2 firefighters in the ambulance.
First part of the question? Certain calls?
When you go on a call, you send 2 firefighters in the ambulance.
It depends on the nature of the call. If it's an an EMS call,
Right.
medical aid. If they're going out for investigation, that's something we've looked at. Certain investigations, they take the engine of the squad.
My
So
point is, if it's an emergency, doesn't a police officer also show up at the scene?
Yes,
So that's 3 people you have there,
that's correct.
right? And you're asking for 3. You already have 3 there.
If you want to say the police are on scene, that's correct.
Right.
What you asking for?
We're looking
But
for
then we're
paramedics.
also, but then we're not EMTs.
All your
So-
police officers on EMTs?
Okay, so years ago, so here's the history in case you don't know. Been here forever, worked here in Medfield, ran the EMS system here in Medfield back in the late 70s and early 80s. Went over to Wellesley, worked next door to Jack. Jack was an LT over in Needham Police Department. Over there, ran the ambulance system for the Wellesley Police Department also. So, know that whole part of it. So the entire Medfield Police Department and a lot of volunteers, we're all EMTs, myself included. I was an EMT for over 42 years. My folks have not been doing that anymore because overtime costs, recertification costs, we pretty well eliminated. So we have, I think, 1 EMT certified currently, and that person is a dispatcher. So we have no EMTs to volunteer to help these folks out at a medical.
But they're still first responders.
They're first responders, we can't drive their ambulance.
A gurney.
Oh, absolutely, but we can't be of any help to them as far as being in the ambulance and whatnot. I mean, we can't do a darn thing with that. We can do a lot of that. But I will also tell you that if we get a cardiac arrest, that's an automatic put the box on. We got a motor vehicle crash, 2 or 3 automatic put the box on.
What does put the box on?
So put the box on means.
Take it away, Chief.
Yeah, okay, I shouldn't be taking this from the red side. So you put the box on, the tone goes out over the paging system. You call firefighters like, these gang, they've got the pager goes off, they come to the station and ready to do whatever. And sometimes like on a Wednesday at 10 o'clock in the morning, maybe you get 3. On a Wednesday at 10 minutes to 9 at night, maybe you get 10, 12. Bob, what do you think?
Yeah.
Right, so it depends on the numbers you get. And that's making the decision that we're gonna need help, and we bring that help in. We get a call for an apartment fire on Prairie Street, and the smoke coming out of the building. Box, don't even bother investigating. Box goes on. My dispatchers make that decision.
Oh, sure.
I'm Aaron Kinney, I'm the fire chief in Sherwood, but also a taxpayer and resident here at 2 Kingsbury Drive. Just for information and just to help with the argument, I don't know if you all are aware, but the majority of the U.S., when you call for an ambulance or when you call for an EMS call, you get 5 to 6 people responding. It's a minimum, usually 3-man engine company and a 2-man ambulance in most cases. You go to Framingham, you get 6 or 5. You can attest to that. You go to Natick, you get a minimum of 5. You go to your Westwood, you're getting probably 4 or 5, right? So realistically, what is being presented to you is a comparable level of service, because I just did this research in terms of what ISO ratings are and the level of service that different communities are getting, because I'm trying to justify improvements in my community as well. You're getting a comparable level of service for significantly less money. In the grand scheme of things. In the grand scheme of things, the town of Medfield is getting comparable service to a larger, more fiscally, wealthy community at a significantly discounted price. Because of the call firefighters and because of the way this department has been managed and the way that they do business. So that is a benefit to all of us, and that's something to keep in mind when you're really looking at this and evaluating, does it bring value to the town? Yeah, absolutely. In many, many ways. I feel like it's a snowball effect. If you add one person, I would encourage all of you to look at studies that have been done on staffing of a fire apparatus and how like exponentially different it looks from a 3-man crew to a 2-man crew when you pull up on a cardiac arrest, even when you pull up on a structure fire, when you pull up on just a basic alarm, the activities that can be done and the things that can get done to mitigate that situation and limit the potential harm are not just a little bit, it is exponentially different and better just from having one extra set of hands. Yes, sir.
Drew Rogers, 11 Wild Holly. To that point, this is not about fires specifically, this is about ALS care. So, although those points may be true, the question is ALS care. And now you're bringing 3 people where it sounds like we're not training the people here or making them become paramedics, so that we're adding some paramedics but keeping non-paramedics. So now we're bringing some EMTs, which we've said that we need paramedics so they provide a higher level of care. So we're kind of bringing some people that are higher level and some that aren't. And that doesn't seem to, I understand your point about more people there, but not for fires and things like that, because that's not what we're here for.
Don't lose sight of what they're proposing is bringing 2 paramedic trained practitioners to the table, which you don't have currently.
Correct.
So keep in mind that they're cross-trained as well. So yeah, we're talking about ALS. What I'm trying to emphasize is this has a major impact that is a snowball effect, if you will. It's not just the ALS you're getting. You're going to get enhanced fire protection plus enhanced EMS by this investment. Not just, you can look at it singularly as ALS because that alone, just like I shared with you, the national average, most places are sending 5 to 6 people to your average medical call. You're going to now have that up to 3. You know, so either way you look at it, you're going to get an enhanced medical response and better service. You know, and for me, you know, taking my fireside hat off, just as a citizen, if I happen to stroke out or have a heart attack tonight, you know, unfortunately, there's going to be a delay in the level of intervention that I get. And that will, at some point, affect the quality of life of someone. It may not have already, it could have already, we don't know. But the reality is that's what's on the table. Whether we have the capability for that rapid intervention, if it's your child, you know, or if it's your mother, father, like this is really quality of life and potentially life and death that you're talking about. So you have an enhanced standard of care, both from a emergency medical side, but also from emergency response period on the fire side as well. So your whole picture of looking at all hazards mitigation, which is what fire departments do, that's how you justify the means of existence, right? We respond to everything. Anything the police can't do, we do it. And we literally respond to everything. We don't come to domestics unless somebody's bleeding, in which case we'll take care of that too. But we do everything. So now that capability is enhanced because you're putting another trained, cross-trained person that can do both EMS and fire and hazmat and extrication, technical rescue. You're putting another set of hands in that loop that enhances that standard of care and enhances that capability for this town. So this investment is not just only EMS, even though realistically in my brain that's most important because that's most likely what one of us is going to have to call 911 for is a medical emergency, statistically. But on the flip side of it, if you happen to leave your French fries on and you run out the house and your house catches on fire, the outcome of that is probably going to be better because you have a 3-man crew responding initially with the support of the 14 or 15 call guys. Now all of a sudden you take care of that situation and you kill it in a shorter span of time because your initial impact is much greater.
Just one question, Chief. We were talking earlier about in that interim period where we might have a PV shift or a shift where there's only one paramedic on duty and the requirement to call Westwood or Walpole and certain types of calls. That doesn't preclude the one paramedic on duty from starting care, however, right?
That's correct. One paramedic with all the medications and equipment on board can start intervention. Absolutely. As soon as he or she walks through the door, intervention begins right away.
Chief, I also believe that doesn't commit Westwood having to ride with our ambulance. If our paramedic gets on scene, determines they got diabetes, they give them P50, wake the person up, they can cancel Westwood and transport that person as a PB truck. So we're not tying up other communities.
While we're waiting, thank you. I'll be around later on tonight and also the next week and a half. Anybody wants to stop and ask questions, directly, please feel free. We're available here and want to talk more. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We practiced for weeks trying to get him to go just long enough so we could get this working.
I'm very happy and proud with who's going to step in here as the fire chief here in Medfield. I'm pretty sure throughout the years you'll have an opportunity to meet Chief Carrico and listen to him, and he'll do a great job here.
So I'm going to represent Steve and myself, minority opinion, and please correct me if any of this is wrong, because Steve asked me to do this about 2 hours ago.
I think you all
So from the committee, I don't know that all of my data and information is correct, but I just sort of wanted to relate to everyone why we voted the way we did. You know, we're sort of looking at kind of a hybrid option, is what we want to call it. You know, we are not saying that we do not want to build up Medfield's ALS. We just sort of wanted to do it more efficiently and through attrition and maybe elected personnel changes, and you know, the possibility of some of our EMTs considering going to paramedic school. And so that's kind of an overview. You know, all the new hires would likely be firefighter paramedics. They'll be quality employees, and this can take months to years to sort of build up the department. And see, we sort of thought of the private model as kind of a bridge to doing that. You know, I was going to go through the private intercept model because I think a lot of people have questions about that, but I think the chief did a great job of describing that. So unless anyone has any questions, I did the exact same information. That's what we anticipate as the model. You know, we sort of like the fact that we could have full ALS immediately. You know, not that long ago, 5 or 6 weeks ago, we kind of found out that we would have discontinuation of mutual aid from Westwood and Walpole as of July 1st. You know, which was sort of changed a lot of things for a lot of people, I think, especially me, perhaps. And the timing was a little bit concerning as well, and I'm not sure why they chose to withdraw mutual aid from Medfield and not Dover Sherborne, who could not provide mutual aid back.
I'm just concerned that I don't know if they can hear you. It's a little tough to hear you.
All right, I'll speak louder.
I apologize.
No, it's totally fine. So, and maybe you could.
I can clarify that because
Okay.
the main reason, I don't know about Dover, but for us, I never called any of those towns. I called EMR, Fallon, Natick, and Ashland. So that's why, and then typically, probably 90+% of my intercepts are from private agencies. So I still have a Fallon hub in Ashland, and I have AMR, which is right there at Framingham Station 1, which is really close to my border. So they come to me regularly, and that's why.
So you just weren't utilizing them?
No, I never.
So that makes sense to me. You know, we sort of thought this was a big transition year, pending contract negotiations. You know, as everybody has heard, the fire department is currently in contract negotiations, and we've just recently gotten a fire chief within the past week or so. You know, we're a little bit reluctant to ask the town to commit to a 60-year plan in this transition year, especially with all the budget overrides. So we sort of thought and encouraged building the Medfield Fire Department through attrition and the potential for our current EMTs to think about possibly going to paramedic school, which it seems like the town is willing to incentivize. You know, they did state at one of the last informational sessions that they're not contractually obligated to do that, and so I'm not sure, you know, what the interest is, but Chief Meany at one point had said that one person may potentially be interested, and I'm not sure. I mean, that's not, you know, that's not a definite, but you know, perhaps that's something that can be considered in the future, moving forward. You know, if we build this budget year, we would have 4 fire employees, but that would still leave us with 2 paramedics short of full ALS. And a lot of that has to do with, you know, regionalization requirements of, unfortunately, a small region that Medfield is in, and not the whole state of Massachusetts and really across the United States. So we possibly could need 2 more hires in addition to the 2 that we have on staff and the 4 that we are requesting. Now, with that being said, for full disclosure, there is this PB waiver that we talk about all the time, and that's a paramedic basic waiver that gets granted by the region. As long as you're moving toward full ALS, they will grant you this waiver, but it is a temporary waiver. And you know, Brendan kind of reiterated to the committee that he thinks that we would not have issue getting the waiver, but that's not 100%.
You need, the 4 that they're requesting will not satisfy the requirement without the waiver. So buying, we sort of felt that our option kind of bought us time through attrition potentially. Just to describe the bidding process with these private companies, it was a really frustrating process just by, I think, the nature of the bidding process. So when we sort of put out a request for information, which as Christine kind of worked through it with us, they can't really give you a bid without having a contract to award. So we don't have specific numbers per se. We did get 3 bids, one was about $550 to $600 as Gus suggested. And we thought that was sort of viable because that company had come in with that bid on other occasions, or they had talked about it. They had actually come in and spoke to us. They did have to withdraw the bid because it came in late, and for ethical considerations, it wasn't an appropriate bid for us to really consider and hang our hat on. But I think the other 2 bids were upwards of $700,000 to $800,000, if I'm not.
800,000 with 50,000 a year acceleration over 3 years, and then the other one was just $1 million, and they didn't say one way or the other.
Okay, so the next best bid was 800. So, in all honesty, this is a major factor that really impacted the process, and it's a problem because we really don't have a good handle on it. And when we go to town meeting to sort of present our minority opinion, I don't even know if we're able to request a number because we don't have an actual number, and we were sort of going to work with Gus on that in the next few days. Maybe we don't even need to request a number. We don't really know the answer to that. But we do know it for sure will be definitely an initial bigger upfront cost. Absolutely. There's no debating that. But we kind of thought if we could provide mutual aid to other towns with this private option as of July 1st, maybe it could chip away a little bit at that. Will it be significant? Probably not, in all reality. As far as staffing goes, we would have 4 total staff members, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You sort of have the flexibility to split your personnel, including our own team, in conditions related to multiple simultaneous calls. It would just give you a little bit of broader coverage as of July 1st. A big issue with me and how I sort of ended up on this committee is skill retention. The private medics respond to approximately 700 calls a year, and they are rotated through higher volume areas. So Steve and I sort of like the idea that you can negotiate that into the contract, that your paramedics can be rotated through areas like Brockton, and these guys are maintaining their skills, and without a doubt, practice and volume equates to better outcomes. Smaller volume towns do have dilution of skills, unfortunately, and some of our guys do work for private companies as well, so they are getting the experience in that capacity. But as Gus had said, we only really do about 400 to 500 EMS calls a year, with 190 of them being ALS, and that's been steady for a long time. So you're talking about, with building up this department, it would really be only 30 to 40 ALS calls a year. If we built into the contract these private companies, that you're getting somebody experienced, somebody potentially with a buddy system, less experienced with more experienced. Another nice advantage is we like that personnel management could sort of be outsourced. So if an employee doesn't meet professional standards of care, you do have the flexibility to terminate them. This can be sort of challenging with contracted employees, and this is in contrast sort of what the chief said. He said they like having control over the fire department. We sort of like the flexibility, if someone is not performing up to standards of care, that you can say, hey, we need you to fill it with somebody more qualified, and it doesn't become a contractual dispute. So we saw that as an advantage. These are jobs these are difficult jobs, and we thought illicit injury, is a big deal for these guys, for firefighters and paramedics. So it sort of, is not an issue with the private company. They're required to replace the personnel at no additional cost to the town. If these guys go out on workman's compensation, you have to fill in overtime to cover them. This can be financially exhaustive to a small town trying to cover that. So basically, we just sort of like the flexibility of a private company, and we were thinking along the terms of like a 3-year option. We were concerned about the demographics regarding the state hospital project, the education overrides, the Dale Street School, and these are all sort of looming over us, which we're all kind of have heard tonight. We thought it would be a minimal increase in price for a short period of time, and it sort of avoids committing Medfield to a 60-year staffing obligation this year, per se. And this would include pensions, health insurance, as we build up our ALS Medfield slowly, right up without throwing 4 hires right off the bat. And I believe, and Gus, you can correct me on this, our current unfunded pension liability is $39 million. Is that correct?
Well, you're asking me an actuarial question. So you can pick that number, you can pick a number a little lower than that, you can pick a number higher than that. So at least order of magnitude is correct. I don't think it's over 50 million, and I don't think it's below 25. So it's a serious number.
Yeah.
And I think you're talking not just pension, but pension and that long-term health care.
Right.
So it's pension's lower than that by itself. But
yeah. So we thought, we could slowly ramp up the department. Because, another thing that Jeff and I have discussed at length is it can be, challenging to recruit people to a small town. So we want to make sure that Lieutenant Bonatti can recruit high-quality people to this town and not try to get 4 people in right away, which can take quite a bit of time, The regional option, we explored that, as you've all heard. It just doesn't seem to be working out for us. But maybe as Millis and Medway sort of build up their departments, they will maybe think about regionalizing with our department. I don't know if that's an option, but it would be nice. Gus worked with Dover Sherwood, and they weren't interested, as you guys have all sort of heard. And on this committee, we've all kind of wavered back and forth 1,000 times. And we've been meeting for about 10 months, 3 to 4 hours at a time, every other week. And I still feel like we actually didn't have enough time to really explore this the way that we wanted to. And it was, it wasn't for lack of effort, let's put it that way. So we sort of thought the private option gave us a little bit more flexibility to really engage other towns potentially about regionalization. We really do want a strong fire department. These guys are amazing. My neighbor comes over to my house not that long ago with chest pain because he knows I'm a PA in cardiology and I've been doing it for 15 years. And I'm like, what are you doing? We need to call 911. And let me tell you, I was thrilled when these guys showed up in about 4 minutes. So these guys are fantastic. We are not saying that we do not want to build this department. We just sort of, we'd love to hire 20 people if we had all the money in the world, but the reality is the fiscal climate in Medfield just doesn't allow for that. So, we sort of thought that maybe we could potentially buy a few years, look at everything again potentially, and kind of see where we go. And Mike Marcucci made a great point at the Board of Selectmen meeting last night that really resonated with me. He said, there's no real great option here, and you're talking about people's lives, and we want to do the right thing, and we do not have a great option for a small town with small volume. And so this is not the best option by any means. I don't really think we would have loved to have a unanimous decision, all come to the same conclusion, really recommend a great option for this town, but it just didn't work out that way, and it's due to the nature of the business, like I described at these meetings all the time, I use the same example over and over. Like I work at the Brigham, you'd love to staff the emergency department for horrible situations like the Boston Marathon bombing, but you're going to bankrupt the Brigham if you do that. But you also don't want to be unprepared, when these situations arise. So it was really challenging for us to sort of find a balance as to what we thought the right option was. And so that's sort of where Steve and I are coming from, just so you guys know, how we felt about this. And I'm happy to take questions from anyone.
Just if I could real quick interject as well. And one of the dilemmas that we also moved into was the staffing. If you look at the staffing proposal to the far right, this is the hiring of 4 people. You can see there's 2 shifts to the far right. Within the first year or 2, that's only covered by 1 medic. So a big issue that we had and a concern is on those shifts, if there's an acute incident such as chest pains, any type of serious injuries, we're going to require mutual aid from another town for a second medic to get into that ambulance or to be called to the scene. And if another town does not have a paramedic available to help us out in that situation, we're in trouble. We're rushing to, what do you do in that situation?
We have a paramedic.
Why are we in trouble?
You have a paramedic.
So if you don't need a second paramedic?
You can operate with 1 paramedic, and you request.
Chief, you want to
He's spot on right now.
You can request an additional paramedic. There's no obligation for them to meet up. It's an agreement to say we're attempting to get another paramedic. The paramedic that's employed by us, who's operating at a PB level, can operate fully as a paramedic.
I have an actual email from Dr. Volkanis, who's the medical director, and also Dr. Geller, who states differently. And actually, I have an email from you that states differently as well.
Is that
we had talked about. So in certain situations under the PB waiver, it does require either a second medic to be in the vehicle, or to be dispatched as well, or in the vehicle.
To be dispatched, so you request
or in the vehicle as well.
Or, yeah, if you get him, but you have to request the paramedic.
And
It
if
doesn't
another
necessarily
town,
mean it's going to happen.
If another town does not have a second paramedic,
You operate with one paramedic. They can do all the skills that two paramedics can, moving forward.
not according to Dr. Volkanis and Dr. Geller. So they said differently at our meetings.
Steve, if I can interject on that, just on the question side of it. Massachusetts governed by the CMR. The CMR is very clear and specific. You can operate at the full ALS level, an EMT and a paramedic in a vehicle. The CMR requires you to have the request and or dispatch for the second paramedic does not stop a full level of care that can be provided. The CMR does not account for the fact that that second paramedic ever actually has to meet. Correct. You just have to have the protocol in place under your medical director's guidance to say you need to request. What the medical director dictates is the level of hard and soft ALS calls. So somebody having chest pain, and it's pleuritic chest pain, doesn't necessarily require a second paramedic, even at dispatch. Those are the EMD protocols in the fire department. But if somebody falls out of a tree today, 15 feet, they're traumatically injured, and it's a paramedic and an EMT, that paramedic can fully treat that patient, take them to the hospital. All they need to do is request the intercept.
And what if there's no intercept available?
They take them to the hospital.
And they can give the same amount of medications.
That is 100% correct.
Okay, because I have emails from Dr. Geller and Dr. Volkanis says.
I actually spoke to Dr. Volkanis through the phone call after to get clarification on that, because I heard that there was conjecture back and forth, and I asked Mike, and I said, I want to make sure that I'm clear in supporting what you said, and I just had this conversation about the full level of ALS care. It's governed by the CMR. It's not a medical director option. It's not governed by medical control. The Massachusetts requirements from the CMR are what dictate it. The medical director dictates the type and level of calls that they want ALS to respond to.
And I think he had mentioned that here in one of these meetings as well. That he wanted a second, I specifically stated, so we would have to stop for mutual aid, and he said yes on certain
You're asking two
situations.
different questions. So he may have a desire as a medical director, but the CMR is very clear and specific that paramedic can operate at the full paramedic level.
Yeah.
I can just from experience here, we call for intercepts for every ALS run. We've had major trauma from a car accident. You know what happened with intercept? One paramedic gets in there with my one basic, and they transport. There's never a problem.
Yeah.
I've had 2 instances since I've been here. It's been about it's been over a year if you count the time that I started the transition, where both medics have actually gotten in the back of my ambulance for an intercept, which is the part that, I don't want to get off subject here, but it's the part that kind of frustrates me about the state and the CMR is, okay, why is it okay for an intercept to drop one paramedic off with a basic ambulance and fully find a transport and waste a highly skilled 1,800-hour, 2-year, basically associate's degree level trained person who is a practitioner and good at diagnostics become a chauffeur for an ambulance that doesn't even have anybody in the back of it? It makes absolutely no sense. But to that end, intercepts happen every day all over the place where just one paramedic gets in the back with a basic and you ride to the hospital. It happened to me in Sherburne today. We had a patient with anaphylaxis. We called for an intercept. One paramedic got in the back of my ambulance with my basic. No problem whatsoever. Everything was fine.
And I think for the larger crowd that aren't familiar with emergency medical services, the standard of care in the U.S. is a paramedic and a basic. 48 states operate that way. There's only 2 states that require the double paramedics, and in those states, Massachusetts being one of them, it's only in Region 4, which circumferences the 59 towns surrounding this area.
Yeah.
You go to anywhere else in Massachusetts in the PB system, and the city of Waltham and the city of Newton just changed to a PB. They're both in Region 4, but they operate under a PB waiver.
Yeah.
So, and they're trying to set the national standard within Region 4 to allow for a paramedic and a basic in any ambulance.
Yep.
So could I just, I'm going to, only because we're getting a little bit more into a debate issue here, I had said that I wanted to, after a presentation, that we would entertain questions of clarification. So to start with, does anybody have specific questions for Holly or Steve about what it is that they're recommending?
You mentioned one of the strategies was to try to transition and build some time. I also thought I heard that Millis is kind of in this process, is that right? They're trying to build out. How long have they been there? And is there anything we can learn from them? Should we be rushing in now to do this, or can we learn from what our neighboring town has done? What's making sense for them?
I agree with Lieutenant McQuarrie to probably answer that.
I can, yeah, so because I have a big voice and Martha wasn't using her outdoor voice right now. That's all right. The question is there in this transition process, we know it takes some time. We have towns like Millis that we know are in the transition. Is there anything that we can learn from Millis? Do we know? First question is, where is Millis in the transition? How long have they been working on it, and is there anything that we could learn from Millis? And I think the implication of your question was, perhaps if there were things that we could learn from Millis, we should take longer before we do things until we let Millis go ahead and finish, and then learn from them and do something then. So,
I think Lieutenant Benatti would probably answer that best. Do you know you've had a lot of information about how they're sort of building up?
He's probably been working at this for about 3 years. He currently has 2 certified paramedics. No, I'm sorry, 3. And he has 2 more that are in the testing process.
Okay.
So, and he has 3 on shift right now.
So I think they sent 2 of their own to become paramedics, is how they did it. I think some went in-house, decided to do it.
I'd like to go back to your initial question. Since I've been here, we've done that. We've gone to everybody in the area to get their insight relative to what works and what doesn't work. And I think you have to look around, and the answer is quite clear, what's worked and which direction those communities are going to go in, okay? So we've been out beating the bushes, trying to get the insight, to get the best answer to the direction we'd like to go. So we've been doing that. Okay.
Could I make just one clarification on one of the very first points you made, Holly, just to make sure people heard it the right way? Around mutual aid from Westwood and Walpole, we went and asked them, if we don't do anything, can we still rely on you? The answer was no. But the answer also was, but if you do something, we will continue to provide you with the kind of support you have. So the point here is, regardless of which of these options Medfield would choose, the commitment of support from Westwood and Walpole would continue the way it is. It was just the way you worded it.
Yeah, we wouldn't go uncovered.
Yeah,
I didn't mean to imply that.
Just making
we would be covered. It's not like if you have to go this option or else as of July 1st.
Right.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean that.
Yes.
Greg Brody, 20 Laughlin Lane. I just wanted to clarify, for your proposal, what is the cost that can be requested? Because obviously for you guys, I know it's $250. I mean, that's clear. You know, that's going to have a big impact in town meeting.
It is, and I don't know, and Gus, Stephen, and myself have sort of discussed this because of the RFI process. We don't really even know, we don't know if we're requesting money. We don't know the answer to that.
Well, I do.
You do. I mean, we were under the impression potentially we didn't even know we were going to present at all. So, when Gus had said, you can present a minority opinion.
Well, this is actually,
so we'd have to present, I guess, an actual number, right?
Yeah, technically.
From one of the 2.
When the motion is made, there would need to be a number.
So technically, just to be clear on what you're going to see on Monday night, when we first had the split vote, I basically came back and said, are you going to recommend an alternative, or are you going to present a minority opinion that just disagrees with the majority view? And because you're presenting actually an amendment to the motion, that's actually not a minority opinion about the decision of the committee. It's literally saying this is a different idea that we think the town should look at doing again. So it's in a sense, it's a little more powerful than a minority opinion. It's actually one of the rare occasions when you'll see this carefully orchestrated an amendment to a motion before a town meeting. That Scott McDermott knows it's coming. I mean, nobody's signed a contract on how this is going to work, but the expectation is that the main motion will come on the floor, which will be the option that I just presented, with a $250,000 override. That will then be a motion to amend that main motion to adopt this approach, which will need to have an override number on it. So let me, if you'll let me,
Yeah.
you want to get into this. So the issue is, especially this year, because of the budget situation we're in, you'll see if you look in your warrant report, you'll see there is a balanced budget amendment, or a balanced budget which does not require an override, and then there is a warrant committee recommendation that has a 4% school budget increase, and it has certain articles, like the OPEB funding article, that are included in it, which is basically the warrant committee's core option. All other articles that require funding are basically articles that are going to require override funding. This is one of those articles, because it wasn't originally in, it's an override because it was, at the time, it wasn't part of the warrant committees, even though the warrant committee is now recommending passage, but it's not in that base budget. So the original article is asking for $250,000 override, operating override. The amendment will have to have some alternative amount. The amount that amendment is set at is going to have to be an amount that you all are comfortable you'll be in a position to be able to contract for. The data points that we have are one ambulance service that I believe a few years ago had a the actual true number was $584,000. And you all have to kind of figure out whether that number is still a good number or not 2 or 3 years later. What makes it more complicated, so if we approve some level of funding and it turns out there is no private ambulance service that will do it for that level, then we're dead in the water as far as being able to bring on a private ambulance service, although we're not dead in the water about being able to move ahead with hiring paramedics. See how that we would actually effectively have approved a higher level than we need for paramedics, but the money would be appropriated. So this is not an absolute legal thing, but you need to understand the process that we went into with this was a desire to first present a concept to the town. It's not a requirement, but we thought it was prudent for something like this to present a concept to the town and get the sentiment of the town of whether they like the idea of where we want to go. We didn't at the time know that we were going to be so critical about getting the funding approved in terms of an override, but regardless if we needed the override or not, we would have gone to the town and said, here's what we want to do you endorse this view? So now what we might have is actually 2 pictures for that article, one of which is hire 4 paramedics and build the staff up, $250,000 override. The other is private ambulance service, play for some time at some higher level, which actually it's kind of for you to figure out where I could easily see it be $750,000, but the actual only true number we have right now for that second ambulance service is $800,000. So it's a very tough decision to make.
Yeah.
If you go too low, you run the risk of not being able to contract for it. If you go too high, you run the risk. I'm not sure that $500,000 is going to be too high. $500,000 got voted down last year, which was partly what drove our thinking around the option we were recommending. But that's the dilemma. I don't have a great number for you. It's just that I think that's the dilemma. How do we pick a number that's high enough that we have a reason to believe we could have choices in a private ambulance service and actually be able to get one without provoking the entire town into gagging and saying no.
I take your point that the number's going to be a lot bigger with the private option. But I still think, and I've said this before, when we're talking about these numbers, as you just presented them, you're comparing a number which you've already netted out all the revenue to a number where you haven't done that. Mm-hmm. And I think you should talk about them apples to apples, in that you still have some revenue coming in on the private side that would offset whatever that contract amount is.
Yeah. No, fair amount. I would say that given that we're calling for $150,000 in the total revenue to offset the total cost of the first option, the private ambulance will still require transport from Medfield. And so whatever that revenue coming back in as an offset is some number less than $150,000. And yeah, you can take that. And the issue is where you're measuring it from.
Yeah.
If you're measuring it from 800,000, yeah, it helps, but it gets you to the 750. If you're measuring it from 580, it might get you below 550.
A clarifying point I have, your article, as you presented from the work of the committee, and this is a different proposal as an amendment. So the warrant committee recommended passage of your...
On a revote. They initially, just so you know, they were originally against it. When it became clear that the mutual aid would not continue if we just decided that we want to be a freeloader, that's what caused the warrant committee to go back and rethink it.
So the warrant committee recommends passing this first model. And the numbers, I presume, are solid according to them for the $250,000 a year cost for 4 paramedics.
Recognizing they're all overrides. It's an override. They're not endorsing that. Okay.
I'm almost there.
Okay.
So for me and my home, I'm not interested in what the other options are as far as Dale Street and, you know, $250,000 on an average homeowner to have this service that's going to be actually above what we've had is $40 a year.
I think 63 is the number we got.
I met with the assessor on that question. On the average home, or the average cost in town, average house per se, is $634,700. And the tax rate as of right now is $17.03. And I gave her the $250,000 number to figure out, and she said on the average $634,000 $700 home is an increase of 10 cents per $17. So at today's rate, your tax rate would go from $17.03 to $17.13. Okay, and if for some strange reason we went for $500,000, just double that, so your tax rate would go from $17.03 to $17.23. And to your point, that's strictly the ALS, the 4 firefighter paramedics, everything else aside, that's from the assessor and where that would be.
Chief, you never...
Which would come out on that $634,000, about $64 for the average home.
I don't suppose you have any interest in being on the warrant committee.
Retire.
So $64.
Martha, just for a second. Martha, were you going to weigh in on
Thank you.
former warrant committee chair? Did
But
you
I was
have a
at the
point?
meeting last week, and they are split as well. The warrant committees.
It's a 6-3. Yeah. It's a 6-3 vote. Went from 3-6 to 6-3, so there'll be a minority.
Okay, the warrant, I apologize,
But they're-
it said recommended passage.
No, I know, but that just means the majority said, but there will be 2 reports because there's some of the people that don't.
Martha, just not to foreshadow anything or steal thunder, but it's fair to say that the minority report will be a minority report headed in the direction of don't spend money on ALS.
I think there'll be other people speaking from the floor.
Okay. Okay.
There's some diverse.
Yeah, and I appreciate you taking that time. I understand living here 26 years, our town has grown so much and our needs are growing, and I'm grateful for the services, but if I look at this, what it means in lives and quality of life and trauma, not so much money, but I also feel it's important to reflect on what we're actually talking about in building this department and this staff and supporting our town, $60. I just needed that clarification.
Brian Quinn, 23 Summer Street. The proposal over here, we're giving firefighter, medical. And over here for 3-4 times the price, we're just getting medical. We're not getting fire here.
That's correct.
Okay, just want to make sure that's...
Yes.
Justin Ziegler from Bible. You know, I look at this 3 or 4 times, and I'm not sure where I'm going to land on this either, so just be clear. But I remember being in the meeting last week, and the number for the full service ALS, that is not really an adjusted model in any shape or form. It's simply a flat on salary, flat on the cost of employment. And the reality is we're here choosing between a service which is going to cost a lot in the short term, well, at least we know the cost over a certain contract period. We know that cost. The other side is we have a model where we haven't actually adjusted the cost for the salary contract that's going on, or the healthcare costs that could happen, or the cost of equipment, or maintenance, et cetera,
Training.
all that stuff, right? Where it sounds good on paper at this $250,000, which is entirely unrealistic for adjusting for anything. And how do you actually make a decision based on that? I mean, so yeah, here's the issue I have. So I want the bigger service. Everyone wants bigger service. But with the contract, well, I know you can consider a bridge to full service down the road. At least you know the cost for, say, 3, 4, 5 years from the contract. But the other thing, we're not sure where the staffing is going to come from. We're not sure what the cost of the funding is going to be. We become an employer. That's a bigger liability side than what we're anticipating. And I haven't heard that addressed at all.
So the only question I'd have on your point is if you were saying we're going to just hire outside permanently, then I get the point. But if the point you're making about why it doesn't make sense to hire now holds, I don't see why it would make sense to do it 3 or 4 or 5, 10 years down the road.
Well, reverse that. It's like, what's the sense of hiring a full staff time right now? We're not sure what the cost is when you get a contract in for 4 or 5 years. We know the cost is for 4 or 5 years, and you can anticipate down the line whether you want to keep that or not, and hire full-time thereafter.
Yeah, I think the short answer to that, for me at least, is because that cost of that contract is 2 to 3 times the cost of this. However defective. Yeah. But to your question, that's why. If it was a closer difference, then I understand what you're saying.
If you look at hiring people, or being in public safety myself for years, that contract is for 32 years. Because most people stay in either the fire service or police service for 32 years. So what you're deciding is you're hiring 4 people for 32 years each.
Well,
and the cost of that, I can see what he's saying. That private service for 4 or 5 years is cheap compared to hiring people for 32 years.
Unless the need remains for 32 years.
But the key term is liability.
What do you mean, unless the need?
When you say you're hiring people,
it's always going to be there for fire service.
so you're always going to need. Let me put it a little different. We have 8 firefighters right now. I don't think it's a mistake that we have 8 firefighters right now. I think the town respects and admires and likes the firefighters we have, and we're not worried about firefighting needs or emergent or ambulance needs going away. So the fact that they will be employed by the town for, if it's 32 years, they're meeting the needs of the town for 32 years as well.
So the 4 people that you want to hire, they're going to be here for 32 years.
Unless the town no longer needs that service. I mean, there's ways you can, if there's a reason why you drop your size.
Once people get into the fire service or the police department, it's very hard to get rid of them. I've seen one layoff, and that was around 1990. We had to lay off 2 people. That's the only layoff I've ever seen, so that's been over 40 years.
Give us some time.
Mara, to the point that is being made right now, I would feel a lot more comfortable. I like the idea of having people in our town. I would feel a lot more comfortable with the number if it were fleshed out a little more, right? Like, what is this really going to cost us? We've talked, I've been to a number of these meetings now. I watched the Board of Selectmen meeting last night on TV.
Thanks.
Watching.
Yeah. Trying to build up the Nielsen ratings up.
That's the one.
There was one person registered.
One person was registered.
So we watched, and so I think a lot of questions have been asked about what else is this going to encompass, right? And the $70,000 is going to come from the fire department budget. Where is that really coming from, right? To your point, like, where is $70,000 coming from? How does anybody in this budget environment have $70,000 that they can just come up with? What else is required in terms of equipment? What other one-time costs? What long-term costs? How, in terms of workers' comp, how often are people injured, and what does that cost the town?
Well, again, I call your attention to the fact that the cost you saw from us included those costs.
Is that workers' comp what it costs if someone's injured, or is that the insurance for workers' comp? Right?
Well,
That's a really
it's the
It's the insurance thing. I mean, but so the town has a budget for workers' comp.
And
So
that's,
sure.
then that's fixed, that's.
Well, it's not fixed, because that's why we have a $700,000 problem this
No, I
year.
mean,
What I'm getting at, what I'm
But that's
saying
exactly
is, when
my
you look
point.
at that cost, I don't want you to lose sight of the fact, this is the first time you've seen anybody give the full-up labor cost for a hire. That's, it's just, I'm just trying to make the financial point of it.
And I appreciate that, because I'm still learning, so.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're talking about, I think what, it sounds like what people are concerned about are there costs that will occur because we're an employer? There's a large liability side to being an employer, right? There's a huge liability side. One of which you've talked about a number of times, which is the healthcare costs that have gotten higher and higher, exponentially higher, much faster than we thought would happen. What else could there be, right? So to the point of the private side, it's a lot more that at least we know versus what can explode on the in-house side. And to be fair, I would way rather have people in town, employed in the fire department in town. But the numbers make me
So let me respond a couple, or, okay. Yeah, I just want to cover a couple things, and I'll accept any corrections here, but to your point, I think it's fair to say the analysis that we focused on was the recurring cost of the labor. So the one-time capital costs, for two reasons. Number one, it was a number that appeared to be below 100,000, and number two, it appeared that there are sources to get get grant funds to cover those things. Intuitively, it makes sense to me that there would be, because I can imagine the emergency services industry would like to encourage towns to upgrade their capabilities. So without knowing anything for real, intuitively, it kind of makes sense to me when I heard that that was available. Said, yeah, I can see how that would be available. But you're also talking about some operating, what's the annual operating cost? Relative to the cost of labor, we did not look at that in detail. That's fair.
A quick comment relative to the workers' comp insurance. That number was built in. We have a private entity that provides sickness and injury insurance for the fire personnel, and that number is already built into that. The proposal as far as personnel costs. So.
But what about overtime to cover that?
That's it. The overtime.
That's the overtime as well?
Overtime's a component of the.
If there's an injury, that could happen to anybody. The other point too is you talk about insurance and retirement. In the private sector, the Intercept service, you are already paying for their health insurance benefits and things like that. So that's built into the system. But there's an insurance program that we have for insurance.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to Neil, then we'll go to Chief.
Yeah, I have a few things. So I'm Neil O'Connor. I've been part of the ALS committee. I am that swing vote that went from the 4-2 to a split vote as far as the thing. We've never done an official vote, as Gus has said at the beginning of this. I've been to these meetings. I've sat back in the audience tonight again so I could see everything else from the perspective that you don't always get from sitting up front. I've been to the selectmen meeting the last couple of weeks. I've been to the meeting that we had at the center, the senior center on Thursday. There's lots of moving parts and pieces of this, and I was at the selectmen's meeting last night and I spoke rather extensively about it there also. Unfortunately, as part of the committee and where we are as a town, we're sort of like in a perfect storm of everything you don't want when you're trying to figure out a new service. We are at the point where we are working on numbers for our budget for the personnel is using a contract that's already expired. So we're using numbers that have expired to judge for today's dollar numbers for next year. There'll be adjustments, they'll be small, but it's just the beginning of where you don't have concrete numbers. And I can handle a lot of fudge factor, I can handle a lot of things you're not sure about, but in the long term, it's easier for me to stomach the thought of a fixed cost, even if it's more money today, because I know at the end of the day, at the end of that fiscal year, we don't have any more liability for that fiscal year. The book is closed, we're done. We don't have that unfunded liability of a 32-year employee. At some point, that's going to be pushed on to someone else, and hopefully it's not me who's going to pay that. So that's where the concern is, and that's a big piece of where my change of heart had come from. The issues of the supplies and the equipment and the parts and pieces to make all this go together. I mean, Chief Holmes has done a tremendous job for what he's been able to do, but he's here for a limited time. We just hired the new chief, which I just met tonight. So we have all these parts and pieces that are like an unknown enigma. I think that's the right way. Anyway, so there's too many things that it's hard to determine what's the right course of action. So then going back months ago, we're using the discounted method to go to the override number for the fire department by using the revenue to go against the cost, so that's where we get the $250,000 number. Months back, with Brendan's help, we did do another revenue projection of what it would be, or the cost, if we applied for the numbers that we knew at the time, or thought at the time, for private service, ambulance service. And those numbers at the time, we were estimating at $550,000 plus a certain trip per cost fee. And when that math was done back and forth, we were showing an actual net cost of the town of $491,000. It makes it a bit of a question, but that's based on a bid of $550,000. So currently, when we did the RFI process, we got one bid at $850,000. The other one was a bit convoluted in their spreadsheet, but anywhere from $760,000 to $800,000, and I'd have to spend more time and get someone to explain it better what the numbers are, because they didn't just give you a clean, plain number. It'd be easier to read that way. So if you use the same metrics, so say it's $100,000 or $200,000 more, it's feasible to see it could be a $700,000 number for this. The issue is the one bid that was submitted and then was pulled back. That number was closer to what we were seeing as a number from our tables. Yes.
That bid was withdrawn. How have you seen it?
No, I haven't seen it. I've only heard. How do you know what
the number is? I didn't share it with anybody.
No, you didn't share it with anyone.
So I'm not sure how anybody knows what the number was of the bid that was withdrawn.
I've only heard, and that's where we have to find out. We have to do some investigation to see if there's some way.
Christine Trudeau, I'm assistant town administrator.
Yeah. And so, this may be something that bid is not valid for anything, and we don't know. And so we're trying to figure out how we can actually find what the number is or would be.
We weren't even considering that bid though. I mean, that bid is off the table.
Yeah, it's off the table, but so.
No,
we're not talking.
I keep hearing the 500,000.
I know. Well, I think that's because
make sure it's not from that. I mean, a promise to the company that.
No.
It was
I think that was
withdrawn.
from when they came in to speak with us. They
Yeah,
gave
they
a
came and
range
sat at
for
the
us,
table
but
for
this was not
550.
an appropriate bid. We're talking on the higher
And
numbers.
perhaps we take the time to get a bunch of different bids.
Well, unfortunately, we're between now
I mean,
and
I
Monday.
solicited 30 for the RFI.
Yeah.
Because they originally, when it went out, they let me know that they were not interested in bidding. And then a month later, I got a copy of the bid from them. I had, most likely would have taken it. However, 2 weeks prior to that, I had released the numbers from the other bids. So they were, yeah.
Yeah, so it's an
Yeah.
ethical thing to take it back, which I understand completely.
And when I let them know that I had released that, they withdrew it.
Was that bid in line with their other numbers that they had given at other meetings in a previous bid they gave to the town
I didn't
before?
read it.
So you didn't read it at all?
So that's one thing that needs to be figured out, but it is good to at least have a solid number, and that's part of why the vote got split here, to try to show both sides, and then give the townspeople, because everyone else are the ones that are gonna vote this. We just sort of come up with the best idea we can, and we try to package it as cleanly as we can, and we present it to the townspeople, because it's not only my tax dollars, it's all of yours. And how is it you wanna spend it? Back is how the service works, and where are some of the benefits if you do the private service as an intercept-based system. A couple of the things that you would get is you still have our firefighters doing the transport, because the wheels on the ground, the transport the person is the one who gets the billing. So that's number one. The second step then is about 40% roughly has been the ALS transport rate, I believe. If I'm wrong, correct me, please. But so 40 to 50%, say on the higher end, are ALS transport numbers. That means half the time your paramedic service is not going with your ambulance. So half the time when the ambulance is out doing other calls, you still have your paramedics back here. So if there is another call in town, at least you have your paramedics able to start initial care at your home.
But they can't transport.
No, they can't.
So they're gonna just start care, and what are you gonna do?
Start care and call mutual aid ambulance if
But why would
they're up with ours.
Yeah.
So those are some of the parts and pieces, and I hope that sort of explains parts of it.
Can you explain that a little more? So
Yes.
the intercept service would go with just an SUV that's equipped with medical equipment?
Correct.
And then to Lieutenant Kingsbury's point, like how do they get? So then a Medfield ambulance would have to follow? Is that how?
Or you could have another town ambulance come in, and if it's a BLS service, they would probably go with the BLS service. If it's a paramedic service, I'm not sure what the transition is. It's something outside of my pay grade.
So
They
then-
handle that would work.
So
But
then
keep
you still
in
require-
mind also, there's, all the other communities around us are ALS.
Right.
So you're not gonna have a BLS ambulance come and meet up with our paramedics. Chances are it's going to be another ALS
And
ambulance.
the ALS, and I'm sorry, I'm a total novice.
Yeah, no,
I'm still learning, like, you know.
No need to apologize in this room.
Believe me, we're all
learning.
gonna fall on this, and I'm really just trying to learn. So an ALS ambulance and a BLS ambulance are different things, is that right?
The level of,
The people are different, but the vehicles. are
correct.
different. Okay.
Yes.
So then some vehicle is gonna have to come, whether it's from Medfield or another town, so we could still be relying on mutual aid.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So the last point that I wanted to make to it is, when you do the private service bid, the nice thing again is that inclusive of all your employee costs, it's also inclusive of the vehicle that they drive, the fuel that they use, all the equipment that they supply in it, your cardiac monitors, your drugs, your paraphernalia, this paramedic level equipment, is all included in that flat rate bid. So if it ends up being $700,000, you know it's $700,000 complete. That's the number that needs to be sort of flushed out and see what the number would have to be presented at town meeting. But that's all in.
And wouldn't we be paying for the education of the paramedics from our EMTs to become paramedics as a town?
That wouldn't be in the private service, that would only be if it was on the fire side, and that might be in contract, and that's something that we don't have information on it. So, again, it goes back to, there's a lot of unknowns in going for the other side, and it may be the right decision in the long run.
And if we go private and you're saying it's 700, we'll just use that as a number.
Yeah.
There's a theoretical that we'll get some money back based on transport, some of what we were talking about, correct? So if we keep it at 700, that's the cost. We keep talking about the 250, I'm a little bit confused when the cost was 388, so we'll call it 400. And I appreciate grants, but I'm not hanging my hat on the fact that we're getting $70,000 of gifted money that doesn't exist. With that being said, is that 70,000 for one, or is that 70 times 2 for two different?
So I think there's two things you're talking about. There's the recurring, there's the recurring expense in the ambulance fees. That's where the 250 was. That didn't have.
388 is the number that you gave us.
That's the labor. That's the labor cost for paramedics full up, minus the OPEB. Yep.
Right, and then you said there was another 70. I asked how much it would cost for extra equipment.
That's one-time capital purchase.
But that's this year. We're talking about one fiscal year right now. So that one fiscal year.
It's not a recurring cost. You're clear.
Right.
You're buying a piece of capital.
I'm aware.
Okay.
Thank you. That's 70,000. Is
Yep.
that 70,000? Is that you need two sets of it and it's 140, or is it just one?
It's just a 70. We talked about having two ambulances, the other ambulance is a backup.
Okay.
So let's
we're
say.
only really funding one ambulance. Then.
Correct.
And so now we're now at 460.
If you're including the 70,000.
But what I'm getting at is your recurring, your
Right, but I'm
combining
trying to
recurring.
figure out what we're going to do.
Capital and recurring.
Okay, keep going.
Yeah.
But we're trying to figure out, we're also not hiring the private in perpetuity. We're doing it for however many years we're gonna do. So if
Yeah.
I'm thinking, and to his point, we know what it's gonna cost for 1 year.
Yep.
And then we can decide what and that year's over. For the next year, that 70,000 has to be paid for, along with the 388, we're bringing it to 460.
That's what the part I'm losing. The 70,000 is not a recurring cost.
Right, that 1 year.
Just the
would
first
be
year. Just the
388
first
plus 70, which is 460, which in my mind is a lot closer. 460 and 700 is a lot closer than the 250 and the 700 that you're.
Because you haven't included any of the revenue.
Which you can't include on either one.
Well, no, the difference is when you're a private ambulance providing intercept service, and then the town is providing transport, I don't know, in my head, it's like you get half the revenues, because if the town's, which is a cost incidentally, providing that transport is not, there's a cost associated with that. It's not in the private ambulance contract, but leave that aside. The revenue side on the internal one takes the full revenue for intercept and transport, so you get the full ambulance fee. With the private ambulance service, the intercept fee will go to the private ambulance services, which is why you got, whatever the price was you got, it's plus some expectation of ambulance fees that are kept for the calls that are made, at least in every contract I've seen so far. And then you'd be able to get part of it back as the transporting ambulance. You would get a portion of the fee.
I think it was like 87,000 that comes
So the
back to
actual
town.
cost for next year to keep it in, if we did it, would be 460, the cost, not including revenue, versus a guesstimated 700. That's, I'm just trying to get the numbers, because we have a lot of.
And then in the second year, that 70 would go away, and the cost would be the 380 you started with against again a 700 or something higher than 700.
Right.
Plus 380 plus whatever the salary increase is.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But not owning that for 32 years.
It's not ALS.
Doug Morrison, Orchard Street. On Monday night, how is this going to be presented? Because we've been here for 3 hours on this one thing. Are you going to say it's 250? Or are you going to say it's 700? Or
no, so what will happen, the question is, on Monday night, how are you all going to see this show up? Article 16 will be presented as the first option that you heard, with a request for 250K operating override authorization or approval of a 250K operating override. In the course of that, as that moves toward discussion, what should happen is Steve or Holly or somebody is going to basically make a motion to amend that article to presumably increase the funding to some level that would be adequate for supporting a private ambulance, and there would be a presentation on this alternative approach.
if you say it's 250 when it's actually 400, no one in the gym is going to believe anything else you say. You have to go with the top number and then say it's going to cost 400, but we expect to get 150 back. So
Well,
the
so
net is 250.
But that doesn't make any sense, because what you're doing is saying, let's record, if we did it that way, what happens is you're looking for an authorization for the taxpayers to raise a tax levy above what they should actually be taxed, because in conjunction with that, there's also a generation of revenue. That revenue goes into the town as revenues other than tax levy, and has a direct impact on the tax levy, which is precisely why we don't want to do that. Because otherwise what you'd do is you'd be asking taxpayers to approve inflated override requests, because we're pretending there's no revenue coming in.
No, I agree with that, but I think we should explain it clearly.
I think we would, you all can tell me whether I did it, I would do it as simply as I just did, or I'm not doing it, actually.
On Monday night, if you say we need 250, then...
So there will be a briefer presentation than what you saw, probably 6 slides. One of those 6 slides will show a $400 increase in cost, reduced by a 100,
okay,
and this is at the end point. This isn't even in the transition. But it'll be a $400 increase in points is the steady state situation, reduced by a $150K increase in revenues for the net 250. So you're right. We're not just saying, oh, it's only 250K to do it. It's 250K net cost to the town for doing it, made up of the $400 increase.
Okay, as long as it's not just
yeah,
one number.
no, absolutely, for sure.
So,
Chief?
just, this is for clarification. So Monday, when this is presented, we have basically, I'm kind of confused, because I've heard people say, we know we have a fixed cost if we go with private, but we have no clue what that fixed cost is. So that fixed cost could be upwards 800,000. Hopefully it's in the 500 day, but that's a hope. Where on the flip side of that, we have what amounts to, if you take the revenue that we earn out of it, is about 480,000 or 481,000. That would be considered somewhat of a fixed cost. And I keep hearing the debate over whether we have the liability for 32 years. So we make, I mean, I don't know, like, but if you're talking about taking or making a commitment to an employee, I think the cost of that person is not as significant spread out over the course or continued investment, right? Like, it's a continued investment that's addressing a town need. So we provide we get a higher standard of service, and we get cross-trained people. We get 3 of them that are ours that we manage, that we can mediate. Because one of the things that I have reservations about is faith in a private agency. I will share this. I have had to file 2 formal complaints against private agencies that are doing intercepts for me right now. I haven't got much traction with either of those because we have a contract we entered into and they're providing me with a paramedic. But I haven't got much traction in terms of getting feedback as to what was done to remediate these individuals, what was done to retrain these individuals who went outside of state protocol or did things that they put a patient or made a patient endure more pain and suffering than they needed to. The outcomes of the patients were fine, the patient didn't die or anything, but still, you know, to pace somebody who's conscious and awake with a viable blood pressure is undue pain and suffering. To mule kick them in the chest repeatedly while taking a 10-minute ride to the hospital. So, also, it's a known fact that in this state, there is a shortage of, you know, good quality paramedics. There will be good candidates that are coming out. I've got several that I will shovel down here the second you open up hiring that I know will do a great job and I would trust with my life and my family's life that work for me part-time to look at. But on the flip side, I've seen the quality of medics that are coming from some of the private agencies that we interact with. And my seasoned medics that are coming from other full-time places that are appalled. That's why the formal complaints were filed. So I think that's a reservation I have when you're talking about, you know, taking away our ability to manage or remediate or, you know, work with someone, because yes, you can tell them and make a formal complaint all you want. That doesn't mean they're going to do anything about it, because they have a contract. They're going to get paid, and they're going to send you, in essence, who they want to send you, and you can fuss and want to push back, and eventually they may do something, but at the end of the day, do you have the overall buy-in that you're going to have from somebody that's committed to this place for 32 years? You have somebody that you don't know how vetted they are.
What happens if you have issue with somebody that you've hired and is under contract? I mean, you're obligated to that person. I mean, it's very difficult to remove people.
I think that's a
You know, it's a fair point, I think.
You could just say, like, we don't want them to come back, they're not for us.
You hope you can, you can't.
But you can't.
No, I actually have I think in Middleborough, the fire chief addressed that as well. And he stated that if they had an employee that they did not want, he had the availability to remove them from the staff.
So you just said, no, thank you, don't send them to our
Yes,
town.
that's what he said, and I'm sure that's got to be built into the contract.
That was in the RFI. You
Yeah.
have the ability.
So in that case, you can do that, but I think.
You say no, thank you, and
Yes,
they don't come back.
and I think on Holly's point, if you do have an employee per se in the town, I think it's happened before, where they've had issues, and if they had to remove them, it's a long process, and you know, sometimes if there's a certain amount of time in, they can just end up retiring or resigning.
Right,
And
okay, so it's clear that you're supposed to be able to say no, thank you.
But that has to be written in a contract, so that's something else
Correct.
I might clarification.
Can I interject on this? And I'm going to do this on behalf of all the people like me that basically aren't in-depth understanding of emergency services. I hear all this, except that if you're like me, it's like I don't know how this is going to help me make a decision, because what I'm getting is, and Chief, I apologize, I'm not really trying to cut you off at the knees here, but or you, Holly, because we argued both sides. There's all kinds of ways things can go wrong. What I would say is, of the ambulance services that we had our informal discussions with, combined with some of the documents that I read in their responses, combined for that matter with knowing Brendan, who's with Falk Ambulance, my belief, unqualified from a technical standpoint, is that that is not an actionable risk. I think there are good ambulance services out there, as far as I can tell. There's undoubtedly issues to manage them, but I don't think we would be making a decision on whether or not to go private on whether we have some broad view of how terrible private ambulance services are or how burdensome long-term employees are. I do think that in this discussion, there is almost a philosophical discussion that's built in here around, do we want to hire more town employees or not? Because I hear that in the 60-year commitment or the 32-year commitment. Well, at the base underneath all that stuff is, do you want to hire employees or not? When we talk about the cost of a private ambulance service in the short term being, we know what it's going to cost. It's like, well, if that was a $25,000 incremental decision, I think it would be hard. When it's a factor of 2 to 3 times, at least
you need to understand, I would rather have pay X amount more to know for sure what the price is than to be worried that this price that's projected here could be, I mean, if you think it could blow up 2 or 3 times, then it's a toss-up. But I don't think that's the error factor we have built in on that original number. So my point is, underneath all this debate about what could it be, and what would be the alternative for certainty, and what's the value of that, I think you gotta, that gap in the numbers is what sold me on this. I didn't start here. I just looked at numbers and that's what got me there. If there's a philosophical driver, at least recognize the philosophical driver that's causing the position to be whatever it is, and then it's either one or the other. It does seem like there's a significant price difference between the two.
I think that was for clarification. That's really what I wanted to emphasize is the cost benefit of going with a private worth what amounts to $400,000 to $500,000.
The question there was that is you've taken it from one side. And I'm not honestly, just you raised the question well. It's like, where do we end up here? I mean, this is a really hard decision, but you're taking one side. The other side would say, look at some place where like, what if you end up hiring a guy who could be well regarded, and he doesn't do a great job of what he's doing, and all of a sudden that patient become a public guy is suffering. What is the remediation process for a public employee? I have no idea.
And just real quick.
And I say it just because even at the area.
Yeah, well, I'm saying that when I say
it's not
cost
$100,000, it's a couple. It could be forever.
right, and it could be long term, and I think that's valid. But I'm saying in terms of, okay, so if we go with private, I guess looking at this standpoint, I'm looking at what are we investing as a town if we go with the private, and we spend $750,000. Yeah, but
what do you do?
I think there's a risk either way, because technically, you could have the same risk with bringing in the private. And yeah, you're right, you can probably shed or get rid of someone, but if they get a contract for $750,000 for an annual contract, and then they get paid whatever they're getting paid per intercept and all of that, there's cost associated with that. We do have a little bit of revenue from transports, but not knowing what that is, I think the numbers are firmer on one side argument. Like you said, if the gap was not as big as it is, I think the argument that they have makes total sense to bring in a private because it buys you time, right? You get a guaranteed thing, you get a package in a box, and you get it and you put it on the table and say, okay, now we got another year buffer to lay this out, lay out a good plan, and implement it, right? But when the gap is as big as it is, are we then wasting money? Because we're going to turn around and in the long run, do exactly what the initial plan is in the first place.
I think we need to find out.
That's a great question. This nice lady in the back is, I couldn't even hold my hand up as long as she's had his hand up, so you're next.
Joanna Howland, Blacksmith Drive. I guess mine actually goes along with that, is my understanding of the second proposal was that it was a stopgap, and that as EMTs retired, the plan was to ultimately end up staffing within 3 years, I think, was the time frame. Ultimately, in the same position, where if the concern people have is around the risks of being an employer, ultimately, if that plan goes according to the way I understood it, you're ultimately still going to be an employer. It's just a few years out. So it doesn't really, in my mind, change that risk. It just means, I guess you have 3 more years of risk, but
Could be 10 more years too.
Yeah.
That's it. And it could be in 3 to 10 years. It could be 1 to 10 years. We don't know that. It's an unknown. I know you make a great point.
It sounded
Absolutely.
like the plan you said was about a 3-year period to ultimately
Well, the
end up
contracts are typically 3 years.
gradually.
Yeah, and the hope is to build the fire department up through, on a slower process through attrition, as we said, and with considering, you never know what's going to happen with personnel changes. It sort of just bought us some time. We are not advocating for private long-term
But
in any
eventually,
way.
right, so eventually you'd still end up in the same position of being an employer and having those concerns. So.
Well, we don't have those concerns.
But
I know
that
other people do, but yeah,
are
it
bringing
is,
up, right?
but not from our
Just-
perspective were those concerns for us.
Okay, so it's, your perspective is just fine time.
We sort of saw it as a
versus-
bridge plan
Okay.
because we don't have all of the information we wish we did, despite the amount of time that we've put into this, because it's such a flux situation, the town and everything else. So we thought of it as a bridge plan. But we're not saying,
end up,
we
though, in
don't
saying-
consider this long-term, and as our surrounding towns build up their medic service, and, perhaps regionalization is an option to offset the cost. But our theory is to build up the fire department over a longer period of time. That was our perspective.
There's a second piece to it too, and Brendan hit on one piece of it, and another piece is actually why we're here. Part of why we're here is paramedicine has become the forefront, and the previous providers we have aren't here. And that's sort of a change in service. And we don't know what the next step is going to be in the medical field. There's lots of stuff you read on the internet about the different surveys and studies and what's the best thing to do. There's also the unknown of, and the future's always unknown, using Mike Martucci's comment from last night. You can't plan on everything in the future, but what we do know is the most constant thing in the world is change. And so if this whole field changes and makes another 3 steps in one direction or the other, and we have just brought ourselves up to, full staff and paramedic service here, then there's another broad change in spectrum. How are we going to address that change? If you do it through a private contract, it's a matter of swiping the pen across the paper and changing your contract specs. It's not employees that are here for 32 years. But the other thing is, and maybe with a little bit of help, we can get our representatives and others in trying to help us move things. But Brennan had mentioned how there's a couple of towns within the Region 4 that we're currently enjoying ourselves in that require 2 paramedics on a truck. We're the only district in Massachusetts that requires 2 paramedics on a truck. Wouldn't it be nice if we could get ourselves a waiver permit or excluded and change from that district where we can be 1 paramedic and 1 basic? And I'll give you a couple reasons for it. One, we have 2 paramedics already. There's someone that's supposed to retire in a couple of years. So we'll have 3 paramedics. And in a heartbeat, you could have 4. If we have one of the other guys that are already here, that are already doing the job, go to paramedic school. We could have 4 paramedics in 3 to 4 years. If we have 3 to 4 paramedics and we can get a waiver that's permanent from the state that allows us to work on a PV waiver. Why is that so good? Well, it works in the rest of the state and it's in 40 other states, or 48, I think they said. So it's not a bad idea. The other thing is, we're talking so much about the acuity of our patient care and how it works with the paramedic staff. We average 140, 150 paramedic calls a year that are true ALS services. Now you have 150 calls a year. Wouldn't it be nice if we could make it so we're a permanent PV waiver system, and that way we have 1 paramedic that's doing all the skills, that gets all the repetitive patient care contacts, the IV starts, the intubations, whatever other skills that they have to do, that they have all that, and they have the more proficient skills because they use it all the time. Because as I think Aaron said, the other paramedic is your driver in the other case. So if going into a private service for 3 years gives us some time to try to work on a state level and try to work on a local level and continue to build the department into a paramedic level, I could see where we could change this in a few years and keep our costs and keep people down to 8. So it's a big money up front. It could be a good savings in 6 years. But like everything, the future is completely unpredictable.
Just on these last 2 comments, I think this is hitting now on the thing that's been the biggest thing for me, which is that when we talked about this in earlier ALS committee meetings, about if you were starting from a blank slate and you could magically turn your 8 existing firefighters into firefighter paramedics, we could do ALS today with the same number of firefighters we actually have now. So we're sort of getting, because of the logistics of everything, we're kind of now looking at a plan to add 12, and there are some advantages to 12 in terms of being able to have 3 people and the lifting and all that. To me, I see the point that it would be nice to have 50% more staff, and there's some advantage, but those advantages haven't been compelling to me, because basically I'm still stuck on the fact that if you had 8 firefighter paramedics, you'd have all the firefighter capability you have currently, and you'd have ALS. And so it's really hard to swallow making 4 permanent additional hires. And I think what makes the private option interesting is that even though it's so expensive, takes your average town annual cost from $64 to maybe $140 a year. The thing that makes it compelling is that if doing that for 3 years meant that you were able to figure out a solution where you could ultimately end up with 8 firefighter paramedics, now you've done something which is actually in the long run going to save the town money, even though you had that upfront cost. If there's no way to do that, if the end result is having 12 people on staff, then it doesn't matter, then delaying doesn't make sense. But if there's a hope of, except for some of the other benefits potentially of the private, which people could debate about, but to me the most interesting part of it is if that potentially opened the window to finding a solution to where we could have ALS with 8 firefighters, because that is almost, it's a very low cost and it gives us, it seems to me, everything we need.
Could I just, before Chief Carrico gets scared off on this, before he's actually started working in town, he hadn't signed a contract. No. So he now that you've told him just what you think, the one, and I think I'll let the members of the committee tell me I'm wrong, but there were 2, I don't know that we formally documented this, but I believe there was 100% sentiment in agreement on the committee that our recommendation was, regardless of what their recommendation turned out to be, was subject to 2 firm things. One was that the incoming chief needed to concur with whatever might get approved at the town meeting. So anything you're hearing here does not bind you. It's just the thing that'll be on the plate for you when you show up for work. And the second was that none of this should be put into place until there is a contract signed. I don't think that's a major hurdle.
Actually, I just was given a signed contract this evening.
Okay, so that one's been met before town meeting, but I just wanted to be clear on that as you're listening to this, you actually have the ultimate say-so on what you think makes sense for the town. I would, if I can share this, Chief Carrico has experience bringing ALS into towns in the past, so this is not going to be a new thing for him.
And this is a great community, Bill. It's late. It's 10.
Okay. This is like the selectmen's meeting.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, can we, all right, Brendan, if you want to leave, you can. First, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for staying. The thing that I'm more concerned about for this article, as much as we had a recommendation, there's an alternative. You're the ones that at least are taking the time to learn about this and actually be knowledgeable about it. I'm scared to death of the people who are going to come to that meeting and are simply going to vote based on whatever they are voting on, whatever they vote on. And so to me, I hope that this is not such a difficult, complex, and whichever way you look at it, expensive issue that so many people at town meeting decide they don't want to have anything to do with any of it, and we wind up in a spot that I don't think we want to be in. So whatever it is you think, if you could at least, as you're talking to neighbors who maybe don't know anything about this, impress on them the criticality of this issue, try sway them whichever way you want.
Or after the school budget?
I don't know. Scott usually draws major blocks, but he seems to be manipulating this in a way that's designed to keep people engaged and involved as far into the night as he has to. So thank you very much for coming. I hope this was helpful.
Thank you.
Now you know who the committee is.
Thank you.
Medfield TV. Community shows.